Chapter 1346. Fellow Taoists, have you thought of this? Who is the fellow Taoist that Xiaohua saw? That's right, it's the female cultivator Kaizhuxia that Xiaohua saw on his way to the 100 Herbs sect's Yanong Peak. Next to Kaizhuxia is the Euphoria sect's Li Zongbao, the young cultivator that Xiao Yueheng called a cultivation genius. These two, how did they get together? Xiaohua stopped and watched them quietly. Li Zongbao and Kaizhuxia were both dressed in ordinary clothes. Li Zongbao's demeanor was like jade, his every movement calm and composed. An oppressive aura emanated from him, making others feel ashamed of their own inferiority. Kaizhuxia's slightly tanned face was filled with joy. Joy filled the corners of her eyes, eyebrows, and the corners of her mouth. Her eyes revealed a strange expression, as if she wanted to entangle Li Zongbao. Kaizhuxia's gaze didn't even leave Li Zongbao's side for a moment. Xiaohua originally wanted to go up and greet Kaizhuxia, but seeing this scene, how could he go up? Li Zongbao was clearly unfamiliar with Jingbo City's e-market. Kaizhuxia walked by his side, pointing at something from time to time and saying something. Li Zongbao smiled and nodded repeatedly. Xiaohua thought for a moment, then quietly followed the two not far away to see what they were doing. The two of them went to a few stalls. Li Zongbao was very generous and bought a lot of things. These things were placed into Kaizhuxia's storage pouch from time to time. Kaizhuxia did not show any signs of refusing. She felt that it was only natural. Interesting. The corner of Xiaohua's mouth that was hidden under the bewilderment revealed a slight smile. However, at this moment, Li Zongbao stopped and naturally turned his head to look at Xiaohua who was following him. Upon seeing this, Xiaohua's footsteps paused for a moment, but he didn't stop in the slightest. He walked forward a few steps and looked around. His eyes unconsciously lit up as he stopped at a stall. As a result, Xiaohua turned around again. In front of him was a rather large stall. The stall owner was an 11th layer aura refining cultivator, and the things on display in his stall were some storage bags. Seeing Xiaohua approach, the cultivator smiled and said, "Fellow Taoist, welcome to my 7 Skills Sect stall. What do you need?" 7 Skills Sect. Xiaohua stared blankly. The 7 Skills Sect was one of the 3 great cultivation sects in the country of Shi. How could they have such a small stall? Fellow Taoist, this bewildering insect was refined by my 7 Possibilities sect. Could it be that you've never visited my 7 Possibilities sect stall before? The cultivator smiled. This me was purchased by my sect's master from a shop in the northern part of the city. It wasn't purchased on the market. Xiaohua smiled and regained his calm. He said, I have been to Yi City many times, but I have never visited Qiqiao sect's stall. Oh, fellow Taoist, my 7 Possibilities sect has many stalls in the market. This is only one of them. My 7 Possibilities sect's items are quite expensive, so it is natural for fellow Taoist to come here less often. The cultivator smiled and said, May I ask why fellow Taoist is here this time? There's nothing else. Xiaohua said as he took out the storage pouch and said, This storage pouch I no longer has any use. Let's see if the 7 Possibilities sect can buy it back. Of course. The cultivator nodded and took the storage pouch. He looked at it and said, Fellow Taoist, this storage pouch is not bad. It has a lot of space and hasn't been used many times. If fellow Taoist is willing to part with it, then I will pay you 2 top-quality spirit stones. What do you think? 2 top-quality spirit stones. Xiaohua was a little surprised and opened his mouth, not knowing what to ask. After all, in his impression, a storage bag was worth 10 high-grade spirit stones. He never thought that this storage bag would be worth 2 top-grade spirit stones. Previously, when he heard the old man surnamed Yang say this, he thought that the old man was just trying to smooth things over. Seeing Xiaohua's hesitation, the cultivator smiled and said, Is fellow Taoist in pain? How about you take it back? Fellow Taoist must have spent at least 5 top-quality spirit stones to buy this storage pouch from my 7 Possibilities sect. You haven't even used it much yet and you want to sell it? Don't you think it's a good deal? A storage pouch made by the 7 Possibilities sect. Xiao Hua understood. It seemed that storage pouches made by different sects had different prices. Moreover, according to the size of the pouch, the number of times it was used, or the number of years it was used. The 10 top-quality spirit stones that fellow Taoist buy from the Fuzhan sect said should be the lowest quality storage pouch. As for the one on Xiao Hua's waist, well, it was probably going to be scrapped soon. Xiao Hua's heart ached when he heard this. That was 3 top-quality spirit stones. However, after thinking about it again, he had no use for this storage pouch. Moreover, it had hidden dangers. If he could exchange it for 2 spirit stones, then it was 2 spirit stones. He nodded and said, "Forget it, fellow Taoist. Let's sell it." Okay. The 7 Possibilities sect cultivator had been waiting for him to say that. He accepted the storage pouch and took out 2 spirit stones of different colors from his own storage pouch. One was a blue crystal, like water, while the other was a bright red flame. Xiao Hua's heart skipped a beat. He understood why the 2 spirit stones were different in color. He calmly took them and hesitated for a moment before handing over the blue spirit stone. He asked, "Fellow Taoist, can I exchange it for a fire-type spirit stone?" "Of course." The cultivator smiled and said, "I have a lot of fire-type spirit stones here, but I don't have many water-type spirit stones. If fellow Taoist needs a fire-type spirit stone, it's best." Then, he handed over a bright red spirit stone to Xiao Hua. Xiao Hua thanked him and put it away in his storage pouch. When he looked back, Kai Zhuxia and Li Zongbao were long gone. Xiao Hua was just casually looking around. Seeing that he couldn't find them, he stopped looking. He bid farewell to the 7 Possibilities sect cultivator and prepared to walk further in to see if there was anything he needed. E-market was indeed huge. There were many places that were usually empty, but now, there were many stalls. Soon, 4 hours had passed. Xiao Hua had seen many strange things, but he didn't buy them. Moreover, under the influence of what he saw, Xiao Hua gradually learned about the cultivation situation in the state of Xi. Among the 3 great cultivation sects, the 7 Possibilities sect was good at refining tools. Things like bewildering beads and storage pouches were all from 7 Possibilities sect. Xuanyan School was good at refining pills. Foundation establishment pills and marrow cleansing pills were all from Xuanyan School. Of course, there were many other schools that were good at refining pills. For example, 10,000 Flower Valley, Black Pill School, and 100 Herbs School could be counted as one of them, but they were very small. As for Shanghua School, they mainly refined talismans. Many of the best quality yellow talismans and even spirit talismans were refined by Shanghua School. Huangdao School and 5 Elements School could also refine yellow talismans, but like 100 Herbs School, they were small in scale. There were also many other small details that Xiao Hua secretly remembered in his heart. Before the sky turned dark, Xiao Hua once again purchased a marrow cleansing pill from the Xuanyan cult stall. He had previously purchased pills, but they were all used for healing. Pills that replenished qi, such as marrow cleansing pill and peiyuan pill, which could increase one's power, he had never bought them before. Of course, these kinds of pills rarely appeared in e-market. Xiao Hua's marrow cleansing pill was obtained after a bidding war. It actually cost Xiao Hua 10 mid-grade spirit stones. Thinking about how many spirit herbs he had to use to exchange for these 10 mid-grade spirit stones, Xiao Hua's heart faintly dripped blood. However, he had no choice but to buy it, because he needed to test whether or not this marrow cleansing pill was the same as Xiao Yuehong's peiyuan pill, which could increase his cultivation by a year. E-market closed when the sky turned dark. Xiao Hua saw many cultivators walking out of e-market, so he followed them out. As he walked, he also paid attention to his surroundings to see if there were any eyesores. Fortunately, he was overthinking. There were many people in the crowd who concealed their cultivation and appearance, so he didn't appear to be out of place at all. After he walked out of E-Market, he carefully walked far away, but he didn't see anyone following behind him. Xiaohua found a secluded place and took off his camouflage mask, revealing his true appearance. Only then did he breathe a sigh of relief. He didn't believe that he could arouse the suspicions of Chang Feng and the others with his qi-refining second-layer cultivation. Then, he found a nearby inn, paid the spirit stones, and entered the room under the guidance of the inn's waiter. After activating the restriction in the room, Xiaohua closed his eyes and sat cross-legged. He sat quietly for nearly half an hour before opening his eyes. He patted his storage pouch and took out the marrow cleansing pill. First, he sniffed the pill's rich medicinal fragrance, then without hesitation, he threw it into his mouth. After the marrow cleansing pill melted and flowed into his body, Xiaohua silently used the death catharsis art to refine the medicinal efficacy of the marrow cleansing pill. Very quickly, 2 hours passed, then another 4 hours. When Xiaohua opened his eyes, his face revealed a thoughtful expression. 3 hours had already passed. AI, is this marrow cleansing pill's medicinal efficacy inferior to the Peiyuan pill? Or is this ordinary marrow cleansing pill unable to greatly increase Ai's cultivation? After inspecting his cultivation, Xiaohua muttered to himself with a bitter smile. This marrow cleansing pill, which cost him 10 mid-grade spirit stones, was far inferior to the Peiyuan pill he took at Yellow Flower Ridge. It was roughly equivalent to a month's worth of cultivation. Although the marrow cleansing pill's medicinal efficacy is inferior to the Peiyuan pills, it shouldn't be inferior by this much, right? Perhaps. Only if I refine the cleansing marrow pill again, will I be able to find out the peculiarity. Xiaohua inwardly muttered to himself. He took out the 2 top-grade fire attribute spirit stones from his space and happily looked at them. He also thought to himself, I've heard that these top-grade spirit stones can be used for cultivation. If I'm not mistaken, then the spirit stone's spiritual energy should be absorbed into the body, similar to the principle of taking a pill. But, in the end, how can it be absorbed into the body? I still need to find a way to use the spirit stones. Immediately, Xiaohua stored the spirit stones into his space, closed his eyes and began to cultivate. He immersed his mind into the space, comprehending the changes in the heavens and silently circulating his cultivation method. As usual, the starlight in the outer realm wrapped around Xiaohua. The next day, Xiaohua did not go to the first gathering after City. Instead, he took out the talisman paper and talisman ink for refining the yellow talisman, preparing to refine the ice thorn talisman. Chapter 1347. The icicle talisman was the same as the fireball talisman. They were both low-level yellow talismans, but their attributes were different. Xiaohua was eager to refine the icicle talisman because he wanted to confirm his conjecture. Because it was his first time refining the icicle talisman, it was somewhat difficult. After trying several times, he barely succeeded. The difficult part wasn't the drawing of the talisman nor was it the insertion of the incantation. It was just that when he urged his magic power to wrap the world's spiritual energy with the talisman ink, it was much more difficult than refining the fireball talisman. Xiaohua didn't use a talisman brush to refine the icicle talisman, but when he rested for a moment and took out a talisman brush from his storage pouch to refine the icicle talisman, the difference was even more obvious. He drew a low-level icicle talisman over 100 times, but he didn't succeed even once. In the beginning, when he used his magic power to urge the talisman brush, it was very difficult for the talisman ink to wrap the world's spiritual energy. Later on, before he could finish drawing the talisman, the world's spiritual energy would break through the talisman ink and dissipate in the air. Xiaohua's self-confidence was greatly damaged. After failing dozens of times, he could only change the talisman and refine a few high-grade fireball talismans or middle-grade confinement talismans to comfort himself. This kind of slow practice, when it became boring, he would comprehend the heavenly Tao and cultivate his mental cultivation method. When his mind was clear, he would practice again. Time passed extremely quickly. After an unknown amount of time, when Xiaohua used up all the low-grade talisman papers he bought from E-City, the refining of the icicle talisman broke through to the final stage and was stuck at the stage of writing the talisman. Putting down the talisman brush, Xiaohua moved his slightly sore and numb wrist. Looking at the somewhat messy room, he smiled bitterly and thought, it seems that the 5 elements of the physique are also related to the refining of yellow talismans. I myself have a fire attribute physique. Using my own method to refine fireball talismans, I can easily refine fireball talismans that surpass high-grade ones. Even if I use a talisman brush to refine them, I can barely refine them to mid-grade ones. But if I were to change it to a water attribute yellow talisman, which is incompatible with the 5 elements, even if I were to use a talisman brush to refine them, I can only refine them to mid-grade ones. And if I were to use a talisman brush, it would be even more difficult. How many days have I spent using thousands of talisman papers? I actually still haven't succeeded. Alas, no wonder Senior Ma said that this is a process of accumulation of experience. Xiaohua had long agreed with Ma Qingqing's point of view in his heart. Also, how long has it been? Presumably, Heaven Qi has already forgotten about me. Think of a way yourself. Xiaohua immediately left the house and went straight to E-Bazaar. Although E-Bazaar was the same as usual, Xiaohua, who had seen E-Bazaar before, felt that it was absolutely desolate. After walking around for a while, he bought some talisman paper and talisman ink. Xiaohua then left E-Bazaar. Just as his figure appeared at the entrance of E-Bazaar, a scarlet-red brilliance quickly flew in front of him and quietly floated in the air. Xiaohua stared blankly for a moment before coming to his senses. He couldn't help but be overjoyed. He stretched out his hand and took the light. A familiar voice rang out. It was Ma Qingqing's message. Fellow Taoist Xiao, I've made you wait for so long. If you have time today, quickly come to Huayun Park. I, Tian Qi, have an absolutely great opportunity. I want to see how fellow Taoists' fate is. An absolutely great opportunity. Xiaohua's face lit up with joy. Could it be that you have some cultivation method to give me? Xiaohua excitedly walked a few steps, then unconsciously slowed down. He slowly pondered in his heart. If he wanted to join Heaven Qi, then he had to reveal his talisman crafting technique. This was the key for Xiaohua to join Heaven Qi. However, although Xiaohua could refine low-grade fireball talismans, and high-grade ones at that, he could even refine high-grade confinement talismans. However, his technique was different from the technique used to refine yellow talismans in Dawn Rain Continent. He didn't use a talisman brush to refine them. What gave Xiaohua the most headache was that his cultivation was only at the 2nd layer of qi refining. With such a low cultivation, it was absolutely impossible for him to refine high-grade fireball talismans. Even if he used a talisman brush to refine a mid-grade fireball talisman, it was inevitable that he would reveal himself in Heaven Qi. And the direct consequence of revealing himself was that he might be noticed by 100 Herbs Gate. Heaven Qi was a self-help organization for rogue cultivators. It didn't have the obligation to protect every single rogue cultivator. If 100 Herbs Gate found out, Heaven Qi definitely wouldn't stand up for Xiaohua. After all, Heaven Qi didn't even forbid its own members from fighting. This is a rather troublesome matter. Xiaohua stroked his chin in a daze. He was indeed in a dilemma. After walking a few steps, Xiaohua's eyes lit up. He smiled and said, "How can I be so dumb now? First, I'll use a talisman paper to refine an icicle talisman. Although this icicle talisman hasn't been successfully refined, it's not too far away. If Heaven Qi really doesn't approve, then I'll take the risk and refine a fireball talisman with a talisman brush. In any case, I'll just have to be extra careful in the future." After making up his mind, Xiaohua quickened his pace. By the time he arrived at the Huayun Park, it was already afternoon. Seeing rogue cultivators entering and exiting the Huayun Park from time to time, Xiao Hua was somewhat puzzled. The last time he came here, it wasn't this lively, right? After entering Huayun Park, there were indeed many rogue cultivators inside. They seemed to be busy with something. When they saw Xiao Hua enter, they ignored him. Seeing this, Xiao Hua's original misgivings disappeared without a trace. Thinking about it, Zhang Zhihao attacking a rogue cultivator in the second layer of qi refining wasn't something to be proud of. Moreover, this bastard definitely had the mentality of hogging it all for himself. He definitely wouldn't let others know. Xiao Hua's heart was at ease, and his brows also relaxed. According to his previous memory, he arrived in front of the room from last time. Just as Xiao Hua was about to step in, a middle-aged rogue cultivator coincidentally came out from inside. He looked at Xiao Hua with astonishment and asked, "Fellow Taoist, I'm not familiar with you. Are you, a new fellow Taoist?" Xiao Hua cupped his hands and said, "I haven't joined Heaven Qi yet. This time, I'm looking for fellow Taoist Ma Qingcheng." "Oh, so you're looking for fellow Taoist Ma." The rogue cultivator suddenly understood and said with a smile, "Fellow Taoist Ma isn't here, what? Not in Jingbua City. But fellow Taoist Ma sent I a summoning talisman just now." Xiao Hua stared blankly. "This?" The rogue cultivator smiled bitterly. "Fellow Taoist, don't be anxious. I only said that fellow Taoist Ma isn't in this room. I didn't say he wasn't in Huayun Park or Jingbua City, right?" Hearing this, Xiao Hua's face became embarrassed. He smiled apologetically and said, "I was impatient and misunderstood fellow Taoist." "Ha, it's fine, it's fine." The rogue cultivator smiled and said, "Huayun Park is relatively busy today. If fellow Taoist has a summoning talisman, there's no harm in sending one. Otherwise, it really won't be easy to find fellow Taoist Ma. Of course, I forgot about this." Xiao Hua slapped his head and came to a realization. Afterwards, after expressing his thanks, he took out a summoning talisman from his storage pouch. After sending the summoning talisman, Xiao Hua waited for a long while before he saw Ma Qingcheng hurrying over. Ma Qingcheng had a smile on his face from far away. When he came closer, he cupped his hands and said, "I've troubled fellow Taoist Xiao to wait for so long. I don't dare, I don't dare." Xiao Hua hurriedly returned the greeting and said with a smile, "Seeing so many people in Huayun Park, I know how busy fellow Taoist Ma is. Did something happen in Heaven Forsaken?" "Hee, naturally there's an absolute opportunity. Otherwise, why would I be in such a hurry to have you come over?" Ma Qingcheng said with a smile. So it's not a cultivation method." Xiao Hua was somewhat surprised and asked curiously, "I wonder what fellow Taoist Ma is talking about." "Ha ha ha, this is a major matter in Heaven Forsaken. Fellow Taoist Xiao still hasn't joined my Heaven Forsaken, so forgive me for not being able to give you a detailed explanation." Ma Qingcheng said very happily, "That's right, fellow Taoist Xiao, that fireball talisman, has it been successfully refined?" "Not yet." Xiao Hua said without hesitation, "Failed to refine the fireball talisman. Later. I found a book on refining the icicle talisman and had some insights. Although I haven't been able to completely refine it, I'm not far from it." "I wonder," as Xiao Hua said this, he carefully observed Ma Qingcheng's expression. Unexpectedly, Ma Qingcheng's expression was as calm as water. He simply didn't care about what Xiao Hua said. After Xiao Hua finished speaking, he clapped his hands and said, "That's very good. I already told fellow Taoist Xiao that although refining talismans depends on one's aptitude, if you don't have the guidance of a wise master, it's definitely not an easy task. For fellow Taoist Xiao to be able to cultivate to this extent in such a short period of time is already very commendable." As he said this, he clapped his hands and took out a summoning talisman. With a push of his transcendence energy, the summoning talisman flew away. He turned his head and said to Xiao Hua, "Fellow Taoist Xiao has always been very busy. I also haven't been able to see him for several days. If you don't use the summoning talisman, it's really hard to find him." Xiao Hua smiled and nodded. Ma Qingsheng seemed to have a very good impression of Xiao Hua. He looked Xiao Hua up and down and said with a smile, "Fellow Taoist Xiao, during this period of time, I have been very worried about you. I was afraid that with only one mid-grade spirit stone, you wouldn't be able to survive in Jingbo City. But seeing that fellow Taoist didn't come to Hua Yunyuan or send a message, and, to tell the truth, the longer the test dragged on, the more advantageous it would be for fellow Taoist. Therefore, I didn't urge fellow Taoist Xiao too much. But now, it seems that fellow Taoist Xiao is also mingling very well in this Jingbo City. You even got a storage pouch." "Ha!" Xiao Hua smiled and untied the storage pouch. "Fellow Taoist Ma will naturally know when you take a look." "What?" Ma Qingsheng took it and casually looked inside. There was a somewhat strange expression on his face. He handed it over again and said, "Although this is a storage pouch with an extremely small space, it's still a storage pouch after all. Fellow Taoist Xiao's ability can be considered to be at a glance. I wouldn't dare. I was only slightly fiddling with some things in Yizhong. If I didn't have a storage pouch, it would really be inconvenient." Xiao Hua already had a countermeasure and explained with a smile. "Ha, there's no need to say anything. This is fellow Taoist Xiao's own matter. I, Tian Qi, have never been interested in it, ha ha ha." Ma Qingsheng stopped Xiao Hua's explanation. Just as he was about to speak, a voice came from outside the door. "Fellow Taoist Ma, why are you so happy?" Hearing this, Xiao Hua hurriedly got up and took a few steps forward. He cupped his hands and said, "Junior greets Senior Qing, the person who came was Qing Fengmin." He was also happy to see Xiao Hua and returned the greeting. "Long time no see. Fellow Taoist Xiao, how's your yellow talisman refining coming along?" Chapter 1348. Hearing Qing Fengmin's concern, Xiao Hua's heart warmed. He smiled and said, "Although it's not as good as Senior Qing, it's not too far away." Immediately, Xiao Hua patted his storage pouch and took out the Fireball Talisman refining booklet and a mid-grade spirit stone. He very respectfully handed them to Qing Fengmin. Why?" Qing Fengmin was somewhat surprised. He pointed at the booklet and said, "Fellow Taoist Xiao hasn't finished refining yet, right? Why are you returning the booklet to I?" "Ha, fellow Taoist Qing, fellow Taoist Xiao hasn't made any progress with the Fireball Talisman, but he has some experience with the Icicle Talisman." Ma Qingsheng said with a smile, "I really admire fellow Taoist Qing's insight." "Is that so?" Qing Fengmin was even more surprised and looked at Xiao Hua. Xiao Hua smiled and told Ma Qingsheng what he just said. "Oh, so it's like that." Qing Fengmin nodded slightly. "It seems fellow Taoist Xiao has a water physique. That's why he couldn't refine the Fireball Talisman. This is I's negligence." Ma Qingsheng said with a smile, "This can't be blamed on fellow Taoist Qing. According to Jiang Zhenbai, this talisman refining method doesn't have much to do with the 5 elements physique. Who knew that fellow Taoist Xiao's water physique would conflict with the Fireball Talisman? I guess it's related to the spiritual energy of heaven and earth at the beginning of refining talismans." Qing Fengmin looked at the booklet in Xiao Hua's hand. "Moreover, this Fireball Talisman booklet is the only one in I's possession. Even if I know fellow Taoist Xiao has a water physique, I still have to give this Fireball Talisman booklet to fellow Taoist Xiao." Hearing this, Xiao Hua pushed forward the things in his hand and said, "Many thanks for fellow Taoist Qing's good intentions. This Fireball Talisman booklet and these spirit stones, I said that day that they were only temporarily borrowed by I. Today, I specially brought them here. I ask fellow Taoist Qing to take them back." Qing Fengmin looked at Xiao Hua, as well as the storage pouch on Xiaohua's waist. He blinked a few times and said, "How about this? This poor Taoist will accept these mid-grade spirit stones first. Fellow Taoist Xiao should keep the Fireball Talisman booklet. It won't be too late to return it to this poor Taoist when you've successfully refined the Fireball Talisman." Xiaohua nodded and took back the booklet. Qing Fengmin took the spirit stones and put them into his storage pouch. Then, he took out a sound-transmitting talisman and said a few words on it. Then, he sent out the sound-transmitting talisman and turned to Xiaohua and said, "Fellow Taoist Xiao, please wait a moment. This poor Taoist has already called 3 talisman craftsmen of my heaven forsaken. Let them see fellow Taoist's law enforcement methods. I'll have to trouble fellow Taoist Qing." Xiaohua cupped his hands and thanked him. "It's okay, fellow Taoist Ma must have told you. First, I have the same idea as fellow Taoist Ma. If fellow Taoist can successfully refine the Fireball Talisman, then you can definitely join Heaven Forsaken. I only need 1 talisman refining talisman master to watch the entire refining process. Second, I have some worldly affairs to attend to during this time, so I didn't urge fellow Taoist Ma." Qing Fengmin pondered for a moment, then said, "But this time there is a great opportunity. For fellow Taoists of Heaven Forsaken, it's excellent. I thought fellow Taoist Xiao should also need it, so I asked fellow Taoist Ma to send a message to fellow Taoist Xiao." Xiaohua smiled, cupped his hands and thanked again, "Fellow Taoist Qing is so righteous, I am really touched." It's okay, Shi country's individual cultivators are one family." Qing Fengmin modestly waved his hand, then asked about Xiaohua's life in Jingbua City during this time. Xiaohua carefully answered, but Qing Fengmin also asked casually. He didn't inquire about any details or privacy, which made Xiaohua worry for nothing. Not long after, 3 4th-layer qi refining individual cultivators arrived. Their Taoist robes were very bright, and their faces were full of arrogance that was rarely seen among individual cultivators. After the 3 of them greeted Qing Fengmin and Ma Qingcheng, the first cultivator, who was about 30 years old, was very tall and had a fierce-looking face, glanced at Xiaohua and asked curiously, "This fellow Taoist seems to be a bit unfamiliar?" "He, fellow Taoist Zhou, don't worry, I will introduce you." Qing Fengmin pulled Xiaohua's sleeve and said, "This is fellow Taoist Xiaohua, a loose cultivator preparing to join Heaven Forsaken." Then he pointed at fellow Taoist Zhou and said, "Fellow Taoist Xiao, this is fellow Taoist Zhou Tsengheng, a talisman master of Heaven Forsaken." Qing Fengmin's finger didn't stop, then he pointed at a thin cultivator with a sallow face and an even colder expression and said, "This is fellow Taoist Li Xiaowen." Finally, there was a tanned cultivator with sunken cheeks and extremely small eyes, named Qingyu. "Greetings to the 3 seniors." Xiaohua respectfully bowed. The 3 nodded slightly, except for Li Xiaowen who cupped his hands and returned the greeting. The others casually waved their hands, which could be considered a greeting. Seeing this, Xiaohua couldn't help but feel slightly embarrassed. "Oh, fellow Taoists, I invited the 3 of you here to ask you to help me examine whether fellow Taoist Zhao's talisman crafting is qualified to join Heaven Forsaken." Qing Fengmin seemed to have seen a lot, so he didn't think much of it. "Fellow Taoist Xiao is a talisman master." Li Xiaowen's face was very surprised. "How is that possible?" Qingyu with small eyes said coldly, "How can a 2nd-layer qi refining individual cultivator be a talisman master?" Zhou Tsengheng also said with a smile, "If he really is a talisman master, why do the 3 of us need to come here?" Exactly, although fellow Taoist Xiao has some talent in talisman crafting, but he still can't completely refine yellow talismans, so I invited the 3 of you here to see how fellow Taoist Zhao's talisman crafting level is. Qing Fengmin said with a smile. "Oh, so it's like that." The 3 of them glanced at each other, then Li Xiaowen said, "Then, would fellow Taoist Xiao please display his talent?" "Seniors, please don't laugh at me. This junior is just a beginner, please don't laugh at me." Xiaohua was very humble. He took out the talisman paper, talisman ink, and talisman brush, and placed them on the ground. Seeing that Xiaohua only had low-grade talisman crafting materials, the corners of the three people's mouths slightly drooped. Soon after, Xiaohua refined the icicle talisman as usual. Of course, this time was the same as usual. At the final critical moment, the talisman ink couldn't wrap around the spiritual energy, and the entire successful yellow talisman turned into ashes with a chi sound. Xiaohua's expression didn't change. He put away everything properly, then stood quietly to the side, waiting for the three people's judgment. Fellow Taoists? How about we take a look at fellow Taoist Zhao's level of talisman crafting? Qing Fengmin's gaze followed the icicle talisman turning into ashes, and a somewhat strange expression appeared on his face. Soon after, that expression disappeared, and he raised his head to ask the three people with a smile. Fellow Taoist Zhao, this talisman's memory is very deep. There wasn't the slightest bit of hesitation when waving the talisman brush. Presumably, you have some talent in the crafting of yellow talismans. Qingyu frowned and said, but fellow Taoist Zhao's icicle talisman's talisman characters are of different thickness and extremely uneven. This shows that fellow Taoist Zhao's control of magic power is really lacking, and this control of magic power is the key to crafting yellow talismans. The icicle talisman is only a low-grade yellow talisman, and it doesn't have the talisman writing technique of mid-grade and high-grade yellow talismans. That talisman writing technique requires one to have meticulous control of magic power. It can be said that fellow Taoist Zhao's shortcomings have already blocked fellow Taoist Zhao's path of advancement in the field of yellow talismans. I understand. Qing Fengmin nodded and said, fellow Taoist Zhao's shortcoming is that his cultivation isn't high enough, and his control of magic power is very insufficient. This can only be achieved through hard work. Li Xiaowen said, fellow Taoist Qing is right. I observed fellow Taoist Zhao's talisman characters. Although his technique is rusty, the talisman characters drawn are very spiritual, and the position of the brush strokes is extremely accurate. If it's only the aptitude for crafting yellow talismans, fellow Taoist Zhao is really good. Unfortunately, his age isn't too suitable. What about fellow Taoist Zhou? Qing Fengmin turned to look at Zhou Tsengheng. To tell the truth, when I started crafting yellow talismans, my cultivation was higher than fellow Taoist Zhao's, and my age was also much younger. Zhou Tsengheng pondered for a moment and said, moreover, I spent a full half-year of hard work to successfully craft the fireball talisman. Fellow Taoist Zhao, being able to craft to such a degree is also commendable. I understand. Qing Fengmin nodded, looked at the three people, and asked, then, in the eyes of three fellow Taoists, can fellow Taoist Zhao join Heaven Forsaken as a talisman master? He can't. Qingyu said resolutely and decisively, even if fellow Taoist Zhao can craft icicle talismans in the future, it'll only be low-level yellow talismans. His level can only be like this. Naturally, he can't join as a talisman master. Oh no, I overreached myself. Xiaohua was somewhat anxious in his heart, and said inwardly, this kind of petty trick. I have to pay more attention in the future. I mustn't make any more mistakes. Then, he secretly pondered about how to remedy the situation. I think it's okay. Li Xiaowen said, didn't fellow Taoist Qing only ask about fellow Taoist Zhao's aptitude? Just looking at talisman crafting methods and not looking at fellow Taoist Zhao's cultivation, I feel that he can barely be considered a talisman master. And I have the same view as fellow Taoist Li. Zhou Tsengheng's words made Xiaohua's heart settle down. Actually, if fellow Taoist Zhao practices for a year and a half, he can definitely craft this icicle talisman successfully. At that time, joining Heaven Forsaken will naturally be easy. That's exactly so. Ma Qingchen also clapped at the side and said, I have a compromise. Fellow Taoist Zhao can join Heaven Forsaken as a talisman master today. However, because he hasn't been able to craft yellow talismans and hasn't provided yellow talismans to Heaven Forsaken, before he can craft the icicle talisman, he can't obtain the cultivation technique provided by fellow Taoist Tian Forsaken. Fellow Taoist Qing, fellow Taoists, what do you think? That's how it should be. Qing Fengmin was also happy when he heard this. He nodded and said, it's not easy to become a talisman master. Although fellow Taoist Xiao's accomplishments in talisman crafting will be limited in the future, after all, he can still contribute to Heaven Forsaken. Heaven Forsaken, welcome such a cultivator. Xiao Hua was overjoyed and hurriedly cupped his hands in thanks. Fellow Taoists, thank you for your help. Good, we welcome fellow Taoist Xiao to join Heaven Forsaken. Qing Fengmin clapped and said, fellow Taoist Ma, please bring fellow Taoist Xiao to register. The three fellow Taoists will also go together and record the situation here. From today onwards, fellow Taoist Xiao is a member of Heaven Forsaken. Chapter 1349. Registration was a necessary part of joining Heaven Forsaken, just like when Zhang Zhihao brought Han Fei and Xiao Fengyue along. However, Xiao Hua was joining as a talisman master, so he needed Qingyu, Li Xiaowen, and Zhou Tsingheng as witnesses. Only after the three of them left behind oral statements and traces of magic power would Xiao Hua be officially considered a rogue cultivator. Congratulations fellow Taoist Xiao. Zhou Tsingheng and Qingyu didn't stay any longer. They nodded slightly and left. Only Li Xiaowen cupped his hands with a smile and said to Xiao Hua, fellow Taoist Xiao has become a member of Heaven Forsaken. In the future, you and I will support each other under the banner of Heaven Forsaken. Xiao Hua was happy and replied, fellow Taoist Li is a senior. Whether it is cultivation or talisman crafting, this junior can't compare to you. In the future, I will need senior Li's help. Well said, well said. Let's discuss and improve together. Li Xiaowen cupped his hands and left. Xiao Hua followed Ma Qingqing back to the house. Ma Qingqing asked, fellow Taoist Xiao, now that you are a member of Heaven Forsaken, I won't hide it from you. In the next 2 days, Heaven Forsaken will have a big event. Fellow Taoist is qualified to participate. Big event? Xiao Hua was stunned and suddenly realized, Ink Haze Black Forest. Ink Haze Black Forest? Just like Xiao Hua, Ma Qingqing was slightly stunned, then he shook his head. Didn't I tell you before that if your cultivation base isn't at least in the 5th layer of the aura refining realm, you shouldn't go there? If you want to go inside, don't even think about it if your cultivation base isn't at least in the 10th layer. I also don't know the exact location of Heaven Forsaken's event this time. Ma Qingqing continued, because this is a great opportunity. If nothing unexpected happens, you will have a lot of chances to get some cultivation techniques and magic tools. Therefore, in order to keep it a secret, only a few people in Heaven Forsaken know the location. The majority can only listen to the arrangements. Cultivation techniques? Xiao Hua's eyes lit up. Then he smiled and said, I's cultivation level is low. I'm just going to take a look. I don't have much hope. Not necessarily. Based on the experience of the past 3 years, obtaining cultivation arts, magical artifacts, and pills all depends on luck. It has little to do with one's cultivation. Ma Qingqing shook his head and said, if fellow Taoist Xiao obtains an opportunity this time, perhaps his cultivation will also advance by leaps and bounds, leaving I and the others behind. I have never dared to think about such an immortal fate. Xiao Hua shook his head slightly. That's right, fellow Taoist Xiao, there's something I need to tell you. Because we have to prepare for Tianqi's event these few days, there are a lot of loose cultivators in Huayun Park. I'm afraid there's no place for you. Ma Qingqing suddenly said. Oh, it doesn't matter. I have an inn in the south of the city that I can stay in. When it's time to depart tomorrow or 2 days later, I will go to Huayun Yuan. Xiao Hua quickly said. I will send you a message talisman when the time comes. Ma Qingcheng nodded slightly. Upon seeing this, Xiaohua cupped his hands and said, "Then I'll take my leave first. I'll wait for fellow Taoist Ma's message in the next 2 days." As he said this, he handed over a message talisman. "Okay, I'll also make some preparations here. I won't keep fellow Taoist Xiao." Ma Qingcheng took the message talisman and said with a smile, "That's right, fellow Taoist Xiao should also go and buy some yellow talismans and the like. There's certainly an opportunity this time, but there are also risks. It's better to have some ability to protect yourself." Then he said with some hesitation, "Actually, with fellow Taoist Xiao's cultivation, you shouldn't go this time, but I feel that fellow Taoist Xiao should still go. Of course, if fellow Taoist Xiao doesn't go, that's also fine." "Of course I will go." Xiaohua cupped his hands and said, "For fellow Taoist Ma to think of, I can't thank you enough." The two of them spoke a few more words, and Xiaohua took his leave of Huayun Park. Seeing that it was still early, he went to Yi and wantonly bought some things before quickly returning to the inn. In the following 2 days, Xiaohua didn't rest. He only focused on refining fireball talismans and confinement talismans. In addition to Xiaohua's previous stockpile, he probably already had over 1,000 fireball talismans and confinement talismans. Seeing that the talisman ink was already used up, Xiaohua stopped and muttered in his heart, "Could it be Heaven Qi isn't bringing me along to play?" Just as he was thinking, the inn's restrictions changed a little. Message talisman. Xiaohua's heart stirred, and he opened the room's restrictions. A crimson brilliance flew before his eyes. When Xiaohua took the message talisman in his hand, Ma Qingcheng's voice came through. "Fellow Taoist Xiao, Heaven Qi's plan has changed. The time will be pushed back a few days. In the morning 10 days later, please come to Jingbua City's Xiyin Gate. I will be waiting for you there." 10 days later. Xiaohua frowned and used his hand to pinch his chin, very puzzled. Heaven Qi, where is he going? Why is he being so mysterious? So many rogue cultivators are going, how can it not attract the attention of others? Yes, there are still 10 days. I'd better make the best use of my time to refine some fireball talismans. I'll refine as many as I can. Even though fireball talismans are of a lower level than confinement talismans, they win in terms of quantity and power. It's a good life-saving method. Soon after, Xiaohua didn't delay and made another trip to Yi. This time, he passed through bewilderment talismans and exchanged some confinement talismans and fireball talismans for talisman crafting materials. He didn't spend a single spirit stone. In the following 10 days, Xiaohua didn't leave the gate. He wholeheartedly refined fireball talismans. Every day, he refined nearly 200 fireball talismans. In total, he refined more than 2,000 fireball talismans. Not only that, his cultivation also made some progress in these 10 days. Of course, this kind of progress was still insignificant in the eyes of others, but in Xiaohua's eyes, it was already extremely satisfying. On the morning of the 10th day, Xiaohua finished cultivating and left the house. He went to the inn's cabinet and took the remaining spirit stones. After asking about the location of Xiyin Gate, he hurriedly left the inn. Walking on the main street of Jingbua City, although there were many cultivators coming and going, the vast majority of them came from outside Jingbua City. Those who left the city like Xiaohua were still very few. Xiaohua walked for a while and felt a little confused. He raised his eyes and looked ahead. There was a cultivator walking slowly in front of him. Xiaohua wanted to go over and ask for directions, but before he could lift his foot, he suddenly saw that cultivator stop and stand there respectfully. Immediately, a light screen rose from the lake beside him and blocked in front of that cultivator. A Jingbua City disciple flashed out of the light screen and stood in front of that cultivator. The cultivator saluted respectfully, but the disciple waved his sleeve arrogantly and didn't return the salute. Then, the two of them seemed to start talking in low voices. Xiaohua knew that he couldn't go forward, but seeing that there was no fork in the road, he could only stand there. Fortunately, the cultivator only said a few words to the Jingbua city disciple. The Jingbua city disciple seemed to be angry. He pointed at the cultivator and said something loudly. His voice came along with the wind. Serves you right. How many times have I told you, don't do these things? Don't do them. This time, you finally, in the face of the Jingbua city disciples' scolding, the cultivator could only bow repeatedly as if he was apologizing. Then, the Jingbua city disciple waved his hand and flashed into the light screen. The light screen disappeared in a flash. The cultivator chased after it for a few steps, but to no avail. He also stopped. Seeing that the two of them had dispersed, Xiaohua walked forward again. When he got closer, the cultivator seemed to hear the sound of footsteps and turned his head to take a look. When he saw the cultivator's face, Xiaohua was stunned. Huh? Enemies really don't meet. Why is he here? That cultivator was the loose cultivator Chang Feng. Chang Feng glanced at Xiaohua and the several cultivators scattered around and fiercely scolded, "What are you looking at? What's there to look at? Do you believe that? I'll pinch you to death." Xiaohua's eyes shrunk. He originally wanted to retort, but then he changed his mind. This guy is just a piece of trash. He relies on his familiarity with the Jingbua city disciples to bully and dominate the market. Sooner or later. Let's not talk about sooner or later. He's already offended the Xuanyan school. As long as he leaves the Jingbua city's power range one day, how could there be a good end for him? Why is this young master shouting at him for no reason? Then, Xiaohua seemed to ignore Chang Feng's malicious words. He quickly took 2 steps forward and cupped his hands, asking, "Fellow Taoist, can you tell I where the Jingbua city's Xin gate is?" You have the ability to come in, but you don't have the ability to leave. Chang Feng turned his head and left as if he hadn't seen anything. Xiaohua coldly watched Chang Feng's back. It was unknown what he was thinking in his heart. After a while, he coldly snorted, looked around, and found a cultivator to ask for directions. It was currently early in the morning. Most people had already entered the Jingbua city. Xiaohua walked out of the Xin gate. Before he could raise his eyes to look around, he saw someone calling his name in the distance. Needless to say, it was Ma Qingcheng, who had been abandoned by the heavens. Xiaohua quickly followed the direction of Ma Qingcheng's voice. At the edge of the bluestone pavement of Jingbua city, there were 6 cultivators around the 4th layer of the aura refining realm quietly waiting there. Xiaohua approached and hurriedly saluted. "Seniors, this junior has come late. I truly apologize. Fellow Taoist Ma, you only said you were waiting for a fellow Taoist who had been abandoned by the heavens. I saw that everyone was at the 4th layer of the aura refining realm, so I thought this fellow Taoist was also at the 4th layer of the aura refining realm, but I didn't expect, it was actually a brat at the 2nd layer of the aura refining realm. Your arrangement will delay our journey." A cultivator with a centipede-shaped scar on his face immediately said coldly when he saw that Xiaohua's cultivation was low. Without waiting for Ma Qingcheng to speak, another cultivator also asked, "Fellow Taoist Ma, is this arrangement because of I?" When Xiaohua heard this voice, he felt it was very familiar. When that person came out from behind the others, Xiaohua clearly saw that it was the talisman master he had seen earlier, Li Xiaowen. Li Xiaowen's voice was as cold as usual. His face also had an unapproachable appearance. As if Li Xiaowen had hit the nail on the head, Ma Qingcheng's face was a bit embarrassed. He cupped his hands and said, "Fellow Taoist Li, there aren't many talisman masters in my heaven forsaken. I see that fellow Taoist Li's impression of fellow Taoist Xiao is pretty good. Moreover, fellow Taoist Xiao also needs someone to give him some pointers, so." Chapter 1350. Fellow Taoist Xiao is a talisman master. A cultivator with a frown and a bitter face asked in astonishment. This Junior is not yet. Xiaohua touched his nose and said embarrassedly. He, as long as fellow Taoist Li gives careful guidance, I believe fellow Taoist Xiao will soon become a talisman master of Heaven Forsaken. Ma Qingqing glanced at Li Xiaowen and said with a smile. This is a treasure hunt, not an experience. Fellow Taoist Ma sending fellow Taoist Xiao to I is making things difficult for I. Li Xiaowen replied with a frown. Fellow Taoist Li is right. With fellow Taoist Xiao, this person with low cultivation, our movements will be much slower. We will also have misgivings if we encounter anything. I'm afraid it's not appropriate. Another fat cultivator with a bulge on his head also disagreed. Fellow Taoists don't know, but fellow Taoist Li understands in his heart. Fellow Taoist Xiao's talent is extremely good, but because of his status as a rogue cultivator, there is no one to guide him. Therefore, his talisman crafting technique has been unable to reach great success. If he can take advantage of this opportunity to temper himself, I believe fellow Taoist Xiao will soon be able to provide yellow talismans for Heaven Forsaken. If everyone can help fellow Taoist Xiao, it will be a great service. Ma Qingqing didn't seem to mind their opposition and casually explained. Everyone's eyes turned and looked at Li Xiaowen, seemingly waiting for his decision. Forget it, forget it. Who told I to suffer from not having anyone to guide me in the past? Since fellow Taoist Xiao met I, it can be considered fate. Li Xiaowen heard Ma Qingqing say this and knew he couldn't refuse. He could only nod and say, however, Heaven Forsaken is not a cultivation sect. I also have no intention of taking in disciples, so I won't guide fellow Taoist Xiao for no reason. If fellow Taoist Xiao wants to learn talisman crafting technique, you have to show some sincerity. I know fellow Taoist Li is someone who considers the big picture. Fellow Taoist Xiao, why haven't you quickly thanked fellow Taoist Li? Ma Qingqing said to Xiaohua with a smile. Xiaohua was helpless. He could only smile and bow, many thanks for Senior Li's righteousness. Junior knows what to do. Okay, Li Xiaowen nodded. I'll be watching your performance. All right. Ma Qingqing clapped his hands and said, fellow Taoist Li's group is complete. Here, only fellow Taoist Xiao looks unfamiliar. Allow me to introduce you. Following that, Ma Qingqing introduced everyone to him. The cultivator with the centipede-shaped scar was called Yong Shang. The fat cultivator with a bulge on his head was called Fan Daomao. The cultivator with a frown and a bitter expression was called Fu Shu. The tall cultivator with a dark face who hadn't spoken was called Sun Fian. Xiaohua knew Li Xiaowen. Xiaohua stepped forward one by one and saluted them with a very respectful attitude. After the introductions were finished, Ma Qingqing patted his storage pouch and took out 6 silk pouches from inside. He handed them over and said, these silk pouches must not be opened at this time. Everyone, put them in your storage pouches first. Xiaohua and the others each took one. Xiaohua looked at the small silk pouches in his hand and was rather puzzled, but he didn't ask. He put them in his storage pouch and calmly waited for Ma Qingqing to open them. The others were different. Fan Daomao's 5 fingers moved slightly, playing with the silk pouches. He said curiously, inside, it's very thin. What could be inside? Ma Qingqing said in a low voice, presumably, everyone knows that in this activity, the chances of finding cultivation methods and spirit pills are very high. Therefore, I, Heaven Forsaken, have no choice but to be cautious and not let bystanders know as much as possible, especially those loose cultivators who haven't joined Heaven Forsaken yet. These loose cultivators, some have extremely high cultivations, but their behavior is unreasonable and temperamental. If they knew, how could we have a chance? Moreover, these things are coveted by those cultivation sects and clans. We have no choice but to be cautious. The place to go is written inside these silk pouches. Everyone has one. can't you just give us one? Li Xiaowen was somewhat dissatisfied. How could it be so simple? Fellow Taoist Li Ma Qingqing smiled wryly. Fellow Taoist Qing spent a lot of effort to come up with this method. These 6 silk pouches are all different. I only know the first place you're going to. When you reach that place, among the 6 of you, only someone's silk pouch can be opened. The name of the place you're going to is written inside. The other 5 silk pouches can't be opened. When you reach the second place, only one of the remaining 5 silk pouches can be opened. In order, the last person's silk pouch is the place you're really going to. Oh right, this silk pouch can't be opened until you reach the place. If you forcibly open it, the things inside will self-destruct. None of the 6 people in your group can go. This. Not only was Xiaohua dumbstruck, but Li Xiaowen and the others also looked at each other. In the end, their gazes all fell on Ma Qingqing's face. Is there a need to be so complicated? Fu Shu, whose brows were originally tightly knitted, asked with an even more miserable expression. I also don't want to. Ma Qingqing said. But, we heaven forsaken, are all rogue cultivators. Maybe someone leaked it. For everyone's sake, we can only do this. Moreover, these 5 places are all the way to that place. At worst, we'll just take a detour. With everyone's cultivation, it's nothing. Go, what else can we say? Sun Fian, who had been silent all this time, spoke up. In addition, the 6 of you must arrive within 30 days. Otherwise, this silk pouch will self-destruct. Everyone still doesn't know where to go. Ma Qingqing said with a smile. Are the others in heaven forsaken like this? Yong Shang asked. Yes, exactly. Even I have to be like this. Ma Qingqing smiled wryly. When everyone heard this, it was unknown what expression they had on their faces. It seemed, this was the first time they had encountered this kind of thing. Fellow Taoist Ma, please tell us the place we're going to first. Fan Daomao's face, which had a lot of flesh, was also stiff at this time. He asked with a fake smile. Okay. Ma Qingqing looked around and sent out a silence note talisman. Then his lips moved slightly, and he said a place. Xiaohua and the others heard it clearly. When Ma Qingqing removed the silence note talisman, Li Xiaowen cupped his hands and said, Thank you, fellow Taoist Ma. We'll set off immediately. Fellow Taoists, let's go. I will also set off later. I hope we can meet up there and look for cultivation methods together. Ma Qingqing cupped his hands and smiled. Thank you for your auspicious words. The 6 of them cupped their hands and took out flying talismans from their storage bags. Their figures suddenly flew up and headed in a direction. Xiaohua Fei was the last. Before he left, he especially cupped his hands and thanked Ma Qingqing. He knew in his heart that Ma Qingqing must have put in a lot of effort to arrange him and Li Xiaowen together. He didn't need Li Xiaowen's so-called guidance, but he had to accept this favor. When Ma Qingqing saw Xiaohua express his thanks, a smile appeared on his face. He waved his hands slightly and quickly walked towards Jingbo City. Xiaohua was flying in the air, somewhat hesitant. Li Xiaowen and the others weren't flying very fast, but they were all in the 5th layer of the aura refining realm, so they should be much faster than him, a 2nd layer aura refining cultivator. What should he do? Keeping a low profile, sometimes it's not a good idea. Xiaohua smiled bitterly to himself. Li Xiaowen obviously noticed and stopped in the air after flying for a while. These 5 5th layer qi refining loose cultivators should be led by Li Xiaowen, so they all stopped. Fellow Taoist Xiao, could it be that you didn't buy a slightly higher level flying talisman? Li Xiaowen frowned and said, Fellow Taoist Qing seemed to have already told me when we were in Huayun Park. You're only at the 2nd layer qi refining, so if you don't have a higher level flying talisman, how can you catch up with us? Xiaohua's brows relaxed, and he slapped his forehead and said, Look at me, I forgot about this matter. Fellow Taoist Li, please go first. I will take out a higher-level flying talisman. When Li Xiaowen heard this, he didn't say anything. He roused his magic power and activated the flying talisman, quickly flying forward. When everyone turned around and flew away, Xiaohua patted his storage pouch. It was still the same flying talisman from before. He activated it with his magic power, and his speed immediately doubled, barely catching up to Li Xiaowen and the others. The left side of Jingbua City was surrounded by mountains and forests. The scenery could be considered beautiful. All kinds of strange trees stood in great numbers, and flowers and other things were also like brocades. It was unknown whether it was because of the two great formations in Jingbua City or because of the city's feng shui, but the surrounding spiritual energy of heaven and earth was very abundant. Xiaohua flew with Li Xiaowen and the others for half a day, gradually leaving Jingbua City. The terrain beneath his feet also gradually became dangerous. The trees were no longer emerald green, and the water in the mountain stream no longer tinkled with the sound of flowing water. Instead, it was mostly surging water. Southern Kaiping. What is this place? I don't seem to have heard second senior brother mention it. I've also never heard anyone mention it in Jingbua City. As Xiaohua flew, he thought about the location that Ma Qingqing told everyone, but when Li Xiaowen and the others heard it, they understood. It seems that the five people's faces still have some strange expressions. The brilliance on their faces, what can it mean? Southern Kaiping, is there anything special about it? The current Xiaohua was no longer the Xiaohua from several dozen days ago. He knew how to conceal his strength and conceal himself. He also knew how to endure silently. He absolutely wouldn't easily open his mouth to ask this kind of extremely low-level question. He believed that as long as they got closer to Southern Kaiping, one of the five people would definitely speak. Sure enough, after half a day, the sky gradually darkened. Li Xiaowen's flying speed slowed down. He looked at everyone, and then looked at the gradually approaching Xiaohua. He waved his hand and said, "Fellow Taoists, with our speed, we should be able to reach Southern Kaiping tomorrow night. That place can't be passed through during the day either. Let's rest for the time being. Once we recover our magic power, we'll rush forward again. We can't pass through Southern Kaiping during the day." Xiaohua heard clearly and couldn't help but stare blankly. What's the reason for this? How did fellow Taoist Qing arrange this? Why do we have to pass through Southern Kaiping? Can't we just change to a random place? Fu Shu said with a bitter face. Xiaohua also couldn't tell whether or not he was feeling uncomfortable in his heart. Fellow Taoist Fu, there's no need to complain. We also don't know where that place is. Fellow Taoist Qing also arranged for Tian Qi and so many other fellow Taoists to go, so you must have put in a lot of effort. We're only facing a bunch of flying insects, what's there to fear? Li Xiaowen said with a smile. To be continued. Chapter 1351. Fellow Taoist Li naturally doesn't need to be afraid. That water-type ice worm is most afraid of fire. Fellow Taoist Li only needs to throw out the fireball talismans he refined. How can it not be easy to pass? Yong Shang said with a smile. When he spoke, the centipede-like scar on his face looked even more frightening. Fellow Taoist Yong says it's so easily. Li Xiaowen slightly shook his head. The ice worm is a second-grade demon beast. It's recorded in the Beast Horde Atlas. It's not something that can be restrained by low-grade fireball talismans. On the contrary, if I were to bring a fireball talisman over, I'd be restrained by the ice worm. No matter what, fellow Taoist Li has the highest cultivation among us. Moreover, you're a talisman master. You must have a lot of yellow talismans on you. Tomorrow night, when the ice worm hibernates and swallows the moonlight, we'll have to rely on fellow Taoist Li's yellow talismans to safely pass through. Everyone, don't you agree? Fan Dao Mao clapped his hands. Exactly. Everyone at the side echoed, making Li Xiaowen somewhat passive. To be honest, he also didn't expect to go to the southern Kaiping. In this storage pouch, there were quite a few fireball talismans. Fire serpent talismans, fire rain talismans, and other high-grade fire attribute yellow talismans. He really didn't prepare many. Thus, Li Xiaowen said sternly, I may be a talisman master, but I'm inclined toward water. Icicle talismans are I's forte. Otherwise, fellow Daoist Ma wouldn't have sent fellow Daoist Xiao to our group. As for water-type yellow talismans against ice worms, I don't need to say it. Everyone knows that they won't have any effect unless it's some high-grade icebound talisman. Therefore, tomorrow we'll have to work together to face the enemy. Fellow Daoist Xiao also has a water-type constitution. Sun Fian, who hadn't spoken all this time, said somewhat astonishingly, I wonder how much of the 5 elements water attribute accounts for. How much? Xiao Hua was startled. His brows slightly wrinkled, but then his expression returned to normal. He said with a smile, Junior, only knows that I have a water-type constitution. I don't know how much it accounts for. Could it be that Senior Sun has seen through it? Sun Fian glanced at Li Xiaowen and said, ordinary cultivators have all 5 elements in their physique. It's only when one of the 5 elements is more prominent that this attribute can be revealed. For example, the wood attribute accounts for 40% of the physique. The other 4 elements, water, fire, earth, and metal, account for the remaining 60%. I is naturally the wood attribute. Of course, if I's wood attribute only accounts for 30% of my body, I's constitution would be much worse than my current constitution. What is fellow Daoist Sun trying to say? I also know about this. Xiao Hua asked somewhat strangely. In my early years, I obtained a cultivation technique, which allowed me to set foot on the path of cultivation. And at the end of the cultivation technique, there was a small spell. This spell was exactly the same as the ordinary detection spell, but it was more profound and mysterious. It was used to detect the attributes of others. Sun Fian laughed and said, it's just that I only learned a little bit of it, and wasn't very proficient in it. Fellow Daoist Sun, could it be that you know how much of I's water attribute accounts for? Xiao Hua was very surprised. Sun Fian slightly shook his head. From what I saw, not only is fellow Daoist Xiao not a water attribute, but it's the complete opposite of water attribute. You should have a fire attribute physique. Ah! Xiao Hua's heart was greatly shaken. He really didn't think that on this Dawn Rain continent, there would actually be such a mystical spell that could directly see the attributes of others without using any magic tools. Just as Xiao Hua's mind was spinning rapidly, trying to find an excuse to cover it up, and Li Xiaowen and the others were also extremely flabbergasted looking at Xiao Hua, Sun Fian's face again revealed a perplexed expression and said, but, if I used that spell again to look carefully, fellow Daoist Xiao's physique would change to any one of the 5 elements, metal, wood, water, fire, and earth. Furthermore, any one of the attributes of the physique accounts for 100%. How can that be? Li Xiaowen cried out in shock. How can there be a single attribute person in this world? How can there be a person in this world who can switch attributes? Senior Sun. I don't really understand what you're saying. I only know that I have a water attribute physique. What single attribute, what conversion, I don't understand. Xiao Hua said without batting an eyelid. Fellow Daoist Xiao, don't blame me. I also didn't learn much. I only took a rough look. Don't take it seriously, don't take it seriously. After Sun Fian finished speaking, he lowered his head again. It was unknown whether he was pondering or ashamed. I saw fellow Daoist Zhao's icicle talisman. Although he didn't succeed in the end, according to what fellow Daoist Xiao said, he couldn't refine the fireball talisman. He could still barely write the icicle talisman. If it's not a water attribute physique, then what is it? Okay, let's talk about some details for tomorrow. What physique, what 5 elements, what do these have to do with the ice worms tomorrow night? Fan Daomao said impatiently. Hee, I feel that if fellow Daoist Xiao has a fire attribute physique, and if he can understand fire attribute magic. Sun Fian raised his head and said. But before he finished speaking, he was interrupted by Fan Daomao. Even if fellow Daoist Xiao has a fire attribute physique and understands fire attribute magic, looking at his cultivation, is it useful? Xiao Hua was a little annoyed in his heart. He secretly said, you two, are talking among yourselves. Why are you dragging I into this? I's magic power is low, but it's not up to you to open your mouths and say it, right? Okay. Everyone, there's no need to argue anymore. Li Xiaowen quickly said. We'd better rest while preparing for tomorrow's situation. After that, everyone stopped and found a secluded mountain forest. Everyone found a suitable place to sit cross-legged and regulate their dermic powers. Li Xiaowen flew up again and circled about 100 feet to the left. He reached into his storage bag and took out a few ordinary-looking yellow talismans. He activated them with his dermic powers and hit them on the ground, causing them to disappear. Xiao Hua watched curiously. A thought emerged in his heart. It seemed, this method was somewhat familiar to him. When Li Xiaowen landed on the ground, he waved his hand and a yellow talisman that was a lot bigger than the others appeared. He activated his magic power and unfurled it against the wind. The yellow talisman suddenly burst into flames, but the way it burned was different from the normal yellow talismans. The ball of flames floated in the air, and when all the yellow talismans had burned out, the ball of flames slowly rotated and divided into 2 layers. The lower layer condensed into a ball of flames that gradually fell, while the upper layer scattered into a net of flames. When the ball of flames was about to land on the ground, the net of flames expanded in all directions and divided into several small nets that flew in all directions. They were flying in the direction where Li Xiaowen had placed the yellow talisman. With a light bang, the fireball in front of Li Xiaowen fell into the ground and disappeared. At the same time, the scattered fire net also fell into the ground where the yellow talisman had hit. A slight gust of cold wind was produced where the fireball fell. A thin net formed by spiritual energy also formed around the cold wind. After the net formed by spiritual energy rose into the air, it scattered in all directions. It landed at the place where the fire net had disappeared and stopped. Xiao Hua didn't have divine sense. Of course, he couldn't see this situation. However, Li Xiaowen's method made him somewhat understand. Sure enough, Yong Shang, who was sitting cross-legged at the side, praised, fellow Daoist Li really has a good method. This warning talisman is a high-grade yellow talisman that is hard to find. Li Xiaowen's face was slightly proud. He nodded slightly. Fellow Daoist Yong actually knows about this warning talisman. It's also rare and commendable. I have only heard of it. I've never seen it before. I didn't expect that walking around with fellow Daoist Li would actually broaden my horizons. I really admire you. Yong Shang turned his head towards Xiao Hua with a smile and said, fellow Daoist Xiao, fellow Daoist Li is your master in heaven forsaken. If you want to become famous in the cultivation world, you still have to practice more with fellow Daoist Li. I have never thought of accepting a disciple. Li Xiaowen said coldly. He walked to the side and sat cross-legged. He closed his eyes and adjusted his breathing. Xiao Hua's face was strange. He used his hand to scratch his head. He also didn't say anything. He directly distanced himself from everyone and rested. In the time it took to eat a meal, everyone's magic power was abundant. Only then did they gather together and discuss tomorrow's matters in low voices. Xiao Hua walked to the side and only quietly listened. He didn't interrupt. In the time it took to eat another meal, Xiao Hua understood that the southern Rainbow Plain was a dangerous place. It was the name of a large area of high slopes in the Manjushu mountain range. There were many peaks in the Manjushu mountain range that towered into the clouds. There were endless dangers within. If one wanted to pass through the Manjushu mountain range, they had to go through the southern Rainbow Plain. The southern Rainbow Plain was abnormally rich in heaven and earth spirit chi. There were strange spirit grasses growing there. It wasn't much inferior to the heavenly paradise. Cultivators would often come here to pick spirit grasses. However, there were two dangerous places in the southern Rainbow Plain. The first was the climate, which was very cold. Within 100 li of the southern Rainbow Plain, besides the fact that there was no snow, it was like winter. Cold ice and cold wind constantly blew. Only cultivators could enter. The second was the southern Rainbow Plain. The ice worms moved in groups. Once they came out, they would cover the sky and earth. It was very frightening. The ice worms were extremely sensitive to human flesh and blood. As long as a cultivator appeared near the ice worms would definitely swarm over and stick to the cultivator's body. Cultivators with profound cultivation would either exterminate the ice worms or escape on their own. As for those who couldn't escape, they would be submerged by the ice worms and finally frozen into ice pillars. Fortunately, after the observation of many cultivators, the appearance of the ice worms in the southern Rainbow Plain was very regular. They would appear frequently during the day and were rarely seen at night. If they were prepared and passed through the southern Rainbow Plain at night, there wouldn't be too much danger. However, Li Xiaowen and the others came here in a hurry. How could they have made sufficient preparations? Fortunately, Li Xiaowen was a talisman master and had a lot of yellow talismans in his storage pouch. Everyone wasn't nervous. After roughly arranging the matters for tomorrow night, Li Xiaowen took out some fireball talismans from his storage pouch and distributed them to everyone. As for Xiaohua, Li Xiaowen didn't give him any fireball talismans. Because in tomorrow's operation, Xiaohua was placed in the middle. As long as everyone was fine, Xiaohua would naturally be fine. As for Xiaohua saying that he also had some fireball talismans in his storage pouch, Li Xiaowen directly ignored it and said with a smile, "How can the fireball talismans you bought from the market be compared to the fireball talismans I refined? Those low-grade goods, you should keep them for your own protection." Chapter 1352. At night, everyone rested within Li Xiaowen's warning talisman. Xiaohua was not far from them, but the strange starlight he attracted during his night cultivation was invisible to the naked eye and spiritual sense, so it did not attract the attention of others. Early in the morning, the birds in the forest chirped. Xiaohua and the others also stopped cultivating. They saw Li Xiaowen walk to the location of the warning talisman and point his finger. With magic power, a somewhat dim fireball rose from the ground. When he held it in his hand, the dim fire net in the surroundings simultaneously flew out from the ground and gathered together. Li Xiaowen patted the fireball in his hand and it turned back into a yellow talisman. Soon after, several yellow talismans in the surroundings also flew back and entered Li Xiaowen's hand. Mother and child talisman. Xiaohua saw this and suddenly thought of a high-grade yellow talisman he heard about in E.G. Li Xiaowen held the mother and child warning talisman in his hand and looked at the somewhat blurry runes on the yellow talisman. He patted his hand and put it into his storage pouch. He looked up at the gradually brightening eastern horizon and smiled, "Fellow Taoists, have you rested well? Today, we need to rush to southern Color Ping. We don't have much free time in between." "Ha, fellow Taoist Li, as long as you rest well, we will naturally rest well." Fellow Taoist should be saying this to fellow Taoist Xiao. Fan Daomao tidied up his Taoist robe and said with a smile, "I have rested well and can set off at any time." Xiaohua had a smile on his face and was already quietly standing to the side. "Good, in that case, let's get up." Li Xiaowen took out a flight talisman and stuck it on his body. He soared into the sky. Xiaohua and the others also flew up like yesterday. The day was silent. When the sun set, Xiaohua saw a row of mountains in the distance like a dam, directly blocking their path. It was the Sushu mountain range. The mountain range was very continuous with no end in sight. Li Xiaowen flew in front and said, "Fellow Taoists, the Sushu mountain range is already in sight. The southern color ping is just ahead. We still need to put in more effort and rush to the entrance of the valley before nightfall. If it gets dark, I'm afraid there will be some trouble outside the valley." After saying that, he didn't wait for the others to respond and sped up. The others naturally knew how dangerous it was, so they didn't dare to be negligent and followed closely behind. Xiaohua didn't want to reveal his speed, so he opened up a bit of distance. Although Xiaohua had already seen the Gushu mountain range, it took him a lot of effort to fly to the mountain range. Looking at the round moon in the sky like a mirror, Xiaohua suddenly felt that his surroundings were starting to become cold and clear. Could it be that Nankaping is just ahead? Xiaohua raised his eyes and looked at the faintly visible valley entrance in front of him. Under the clear moonlight, the valley entrance was like a deep crack carved into the mountain range. At this moment, Li Xiaowen and the others stopped and waited for Xiaohua. Li Xiaowen said in a low voice, "Everyone's itinerary is just as we expected. We arrived at the Qiushu mountain range before midnight. Nankai Ping is just ahead. Let's line up in a formation. According to yesterday's discussion, we will quietly pass through and not cause any trouble. Yes, we will listen to fellow Taoist Li's instructions," everyone said in low voices. Xiaohua also flew up and arrived in the middle of the group. Li Xiaowen glanced at Xiaohua and also said in a low voice, "Fellow Taoist Xiao, your cultivation is shallow and is originally a burden for us this time. However, fellow Taoist also has a silk pouch in his storage pouch. In order to not affect the entire plan abandoned by the heavens, I and the other fellow Taoists could only bring you along. This Nankai Ping can be said to be a dangerous place in the Gushu mountain range. Admittedly, we will protect fellow Taoist here, but fellow Taoist mustn't lower his guard and rely on us for everything. If there is any danger, we can protect ourselves, but it's still beyond our power to protect fellow Taoist. Therefore, I will say the ugly words first. Fellow Taoist Xiao, you should be prepared. Don't think that we have to protect you just because you have the silk pouch." Xiaohua nodded and cupped his hands in salute. "Thank you for your protection, fellow Taoists. I will be careful in Nankai Ping. If there is any accident, I definitely won't dare to implicate you. And, since fellow Taoist Xiao said so, we naturally understand the sadness in our hearts." Li Xiaowen nodded and took out 6 yellow talismans from his bosom. He gave one to each person and said, "This is a consecutive note talisman. If you encounter a group of ice worms in Nankai Ping and someone gets separated, you can use this yellow talisman to contact each other. Although this consecutive note talisman can be used many times, fellow Taoists, please be careful and use it more in the future." After everyone put away the consecutive note talisman, Li Xiaowen looked at the sky and said, "Okay, we should also go. The weather in Nankai Ping is cold. Our cultivation may be affected and our flying talismans may be damaged. If we don't pass through Nankai Ping before dawn, I'm afraid it will be very troublesome." Finished speaking, Li Xiaowen took the lead and flew away. Yong Shang, Fan Daomao, and Xiaohua followed closely behind. Fu Shu and Sun Fian flew at the back. At this time, Xiaohua also didn't hesitate. He didn't care about hiding his flying speed and followed closely behind Fan Daomao. This actually made Fu Shu and Sun Fian let out a sigh of relief. If Xiaohua flew slowly, it wouldn't be convenient for them to fly too fast when there wasn't any danger. As the 6 people flew closer to the Mangshu mountain range, Xiaohua felt that the weather was even colder. The air he exhaled from his mouth also became white. Xiaohua's exposed hands also felt a piercing cold. He silently operated his heart sutra and magic power gushed out from his body, blocking that cold outside of his body. Xiao Hua looked at the towering mountain peak on his left and was somewhat astonished. The climate of this Xiaoyu continent is really a bit strange. This place is only a day's distance from Jingbua City, but the difference is actually so big. Could it be that there's something fishy here? Just as Xiao Hua's imagination was running wild, they had already arrived in front of the Mangshu mountain range. Above the mountain range was a layer of hard ice. The patterns between the mountain rocks were transparent and visible. Under the moonlight, the entire ice layer reflected a strange brilliance. The entire mountain range was almost like a crystal. Fellow Taoists, be a bit careful. We are about to enter. Up ahead, Li Xiaowen reminded in a low voice. He patted his storage pouch and took out a few fireball talismans. Xiao Hua and the others also took out yellow talismans and carefully followed Li Xiaowen into the valley entrance. Everyone flew in the air, their shadows were cast on the ground by the moon, rapidly streaking forward. Below everyone, countless craggy mountain rocks were covered in a layer of ice. They were like motionless monsters. Everyone's shadows were cast over. Between movement and stillness, it appeared very strange. However, just as everyone entered the valley, the 6 people's shadows shuttled back and forth between 2 blankly standing rocks in the valley. Those rocks actually faintly moved. Immediately afterwards, the 2 rocks actually stood up and slowly turned in the direction of the 6 people in the distance. Once Xiao Hua and the others gradually disappeared into the darkness, a soft voice echoed, "Huh? This? Which sect's disciples are they?" Senior Marshal Brother, they flew over too suddenly. Little Brother didn't expect that there would be people passing through the southern color plains on a full moon night. Therefore, I simply didn't see clearly. I also don't know which sect's disciples these cultivators are from. They shouldn't be disciples of some large sect. The voice from before muttered to itself, even my spirit husbandry sect knows that the ice worms will act strangely on a full moon night. If it wasn't for some special reason, you and I definitely wouldn't have come to the southern color plains. The 6 of them actually came together. They really don't know the immensity of heaven and earth. Perhaps they are loose cultivators. Another voice probed, "Little Brother, the cultivation of the last 2 people doesn't seem to be high." Hee, who cares if they are loose cultivators or not? Even if they are from Xuanyan school or Qiqiao sect, so what? Since they dared to come to the southern color plains on a full moon night, even if they die without a burial ground, who can they blame? Besides, we were thinking hard about how to lure that thing out and they actually came knocking on our door. This is the best bait that the heavens have given us. That's right. Junior Marshal Brother, let's go take a look. As they spoke, the 2 stones flashed and turned into 2 short and fat young men. The 2 young men clapped their hands and took out flying talismans from the storage pouches on their waists. Using their magic power, they flew into the air. Looking at their flying speed, they were more than twice as fast as Li Xiaowen and the others. They should be cultivators around the 7th layer of qi refining. Xiao Hua and the others didn't pay attention to what was happening behind them. They only focused on the movements in the valley. At this time, the valley was very quiet. Not a sound could be heard. Even the chirping of insects at night could not be heard. It was terrifyingly quiet. As soon as they entered the valley, the stone walls on both sides blocked the moonlight. Occasionally, some low gaps would reveal some moonlight. Only then could they see some light. The rest of the place was pitch black. Xiao Hua didn't dare to utter a word. Holding his breath, he relied on his senses to follow behind Fan Daomao. The shadows of the surrounding tall mountains were like monsters with their mouths wide open. They could suppress Xiao Hua with their dark aura alone. After flying for nearly the time it took to eat a meal, Xiao Hua and the others turned around a mountain ridge. The scenery in front of them changed again. It was no longer oppressive darkness, but a silver, flat ground. Calling it flat ground was inappropriate. The flat ground was quite high. It wasn't a common flat ground. Instead, it was a series of hills connected together, forming a large plateau. Southern Kaiping. When Xiao Hua saw the plateau, the name of the plateau appeared in his mind. When he carefully looked again, it was indeed true. Even though the plateau was completely covered in silver light and transparent ice, there were still lush green spirit grasses growing on the plateau. They were extremely lush, as if they didn't fear the cold of the southern Kaiping. When Li Xiaowen saw the southern Kaiping, his eyes also revealed joy. However, he didn't dare to lower his guard at all. The closer he got to the southern Kaiping, the slower he slowed down. At the same time, he also paid attention to the movements in his surroundings. However, the surroundings were still deathly quiet. Even when Xiao Hua and the others landed on the southern Kaiping, they didn't notice anything unusual. Okay, fellow Taoists, we have successfully arrived at the southern Kaiping. Fellow Taoists, take a look at your storage pouches. Which one of them can be opened? Li Xiaowen concealed his joy and whispered. I's silk pouch has changed. The one who spoke was the fat Fan Daomao. As he spoke, Fan Daomao took out his silk pouch from his storage pouch. Sure enough, Fan Daomao's silk pouch was already faintly emitting a light. Following the absorption of the cold and frost energy, the silk pouch's light became increasingly brighter. Li Xiaowen's complexion greatly changed as he anxiously said, "They really are ice worms." Soon after, he looked left and right in panic, then pointed his finger and said, "Fellow Taoists, quickly, fly over there." At this moment, how could everyone still have the time to hesitate? Naturally, they didn't care about order and swarmed towards the direction Li Xiaowen pointed out. Xiao Hua naturally chased after them, but before he flew away, he turned his head to take a look. Those ice worms were flying very quickly. In just a short while, they had already gotten a lot closer. That small thing just now had now become a flying insect swarm about 10 zhang wide. In that swarm of ice worms, each ice worm was about the size of a fingernail. Their specific appearance couldn't be seen clearly, but looking at the size of this swarm of ice worms, perhaps there were hundreds or thousands of them. Xiao Hua felt a chill run down his spine. He urged the flying talisman to quickly fly away, but the moment he flew away, his eyes unexpectedly discovered that there were several different things in front of the swarm of ice worms. What are those? They look several times bigger than ice worms, and their color is also red. They don't seem to be ice worms. Xiao Hua could only wonder. How could he think about it in detail? Fellow Taoists, quickly take out the weak water talisman and protect yourselves. This way, the ice worms won't be able to discover us. Li Xiaowen whispered. This was also what everyone had discussed last night. The weak water talisman could create a water-based defense around the body. Combined with the cold of the southern Kaiping, it could block the heat of the flesh and blood, not attracting the attention of the ice worms. The direction that Li Xiaowen pointed to was a pitch-black place. When everyone got closer, they discovered that there were some protruding ice thorns. They couldn't help but be overjoyed. Each of them found a secret place to hide behind the ice thorns. Xiao Hua arrived a little late. When he looked around again, there was already no place to hide. Xiao Hua had no choice but to look around. On the upper left side of the ice thorns, there was a protruding platform that was faintly blocked. Xiao Hua didn't dare to hesitate and quickly flew over. When Xiao Hua landed on the platform, he immediately used the weak water talisman. The thin brilliance absorbed the unique cold of the southern Kaiping, causing Xiao Hua's body to feel cold. The platform was only 3 qi in size. In front of it was a protrusion that was half the height of a person. It seemed to be an icicle or a stone. Xiao Hua half crouched behind the protrusion, revealing half of his head and carefully looking at the ice worms. In this moment, the ice worms had already arrived at the place where Xiao Hua and the others were. The surrounding temperature had also dropped a lot because of the ice worm's appearance. The ice worms didn't discover Xiaohua and the others. They still flew in their original direction, towards the place where Xiaohua and the others entered the valley. And, fortunately, we weren't discovered. These hundreds and thousands of ice worms swarming and pouncing on a person's body are not meant to freeze a person into a popsicle. Even with the fireball talisman, I'm afraid it won't be easy to drive them away. Xiaohua secretly said that he was lucky. He thought that when the ice worms flew far away, he would quickly leave with Li Xiaowen and the others. Just as Xiaohua, no, even Li Xiaowen and the others heaved a sigh of relief, a sharp chirp suddenly came from below the valley. Following that sound, several red things in front of the ice worms suddenly turned around and flew towards the ice spikes where Li Xiaowen and the others were. Ah! What's going on? Xiaohua was stunned when he saw this. However, the place where the sound came from was pitch black and he couldn't see anything. It was impossible for him to know where the sound came from. Is it other cultivators? Or other demonic beasts? Xiaohua only had time to think this. Those ice worms had already flown in front of the ice spikes where Li Xiaowen and the others were. Let's go! Li Xiaowen shouted. The 5 of them flew up and scattered into the air. At first, the ice worms didn't seem to notice Li Xiaowen and the others, but when Li Xiaowen and the others flew into the air, the ice worms swayed like ripples in water. Soon after, they divided into several groups. Except for a group that chased after the red things in front, the rest chased after Li Xiaowen and the others. Xiaohua hid behind a block of ice and peeked clearly. Those red things in front of him weren't ice worms, but a kind of flying insect that was about the size of a fist. Its entire body was fiery red, and it had a red and black eye on its head. 2 pointed, small triangular ears were erected on both sides of its eyes. The edges of its flapping wings were connected to its body by a thin membrane. It looked a bit like a bat, but it was also very far from a bat. The ice worms behind them looked like snow. They didn't have any eyes, only 6 or 7 antennae extended from their heads, swaying slightly in the air. The ice worms had a pair of wings on both sides. When they flapped, they made a slight, strange sound. Li Xiaowen and the others' reaction couldn't be said to be fast, but the ice worms were even faster. Fu Shu, who was at the back, flew about 10 feet before the ice worms behind him caught up. Those ice worms were also special. They were originally a bit faster than Fu Shu, but when they closed in, their speed suddenly increased by more than 2 times. They crashed into Fu Shu like a stone crashing into a rock. The force wasn't very strong, but when the ice worms crashed into the light of the weak water talisman on Fu Shu's body, they immediately turned into something like a snowflake. The strange thing was, when the light of the weak water talisman touched that thing, a large area around it immediately turned white and gradually turned into ice. Fu Shu was shocked. He finally knew why cultivators were so afraid of these ice worms. This was just one ice worm. If hundreds of ice worms were to crash together, who would be able to withstand it? Without hesitation, Fu Shu slapped his hand and took out a fireball talisman from his storage bag. He activated his transcendence energy and threw it behind him without looking. A fireball flew out from his hand and smashed into the swarm of ice worms. With a soft boom, the fireball exploded. The flames scattered in all directions, creating a bowl-sized gap in the swarm of ice worms behind him. However, this gap only lasted for a moment. Only a few ice worms disappeared in the flames. The rest of the ice worms surged and chased after Fu Shu. At this moment, how could Fu Shu have any misgivings about others? He slapped his waist and took out a stack of yellow talismans from his storage bag. As he activated the flying talisman to fly into the distance, he threw out the fireball talismans one by one. Following Fu Shu's first fireball talisman, Li Xiaowen, Yongshang and the others' fireball talismans also began to explode one after another. The entire southern Kaiping was abnormally lively. Xiaohua hid behind a block of ice and quietly watched all of this without moving. From the current situation, his hiding place should still be safe. He hadn't been discovered by the ice worms yet. If he could continue to hide and wait for everyone to lure the ice worms away, he would be very happy. But, at this moment, Xiaohua suddenly felt a scorching aura coming from the top of his head. Chapter 1354. Xiaohua's heart was restless. He wanted to hide behind a block of ice to avoid the ice worm's attack, but he suddenly felt a scorching aura above his head. When he raised his head to look, he couldn't help but be shocked. One of the red flying insects in front of the ice worm had unknowingly flown above his head. The red flying insect's black and red eyes were staring straight at Xiaohua. Although Xiaohua couldn't look directly at it like a human, he knew that the flying insect had already discovered him. Immediately after, a buzzing sound entered Xiaohua's ears. When he turned his head to look, a group of ice worms were flying towards the depression he was in. Xiaohua suddenly realized that the scorching heat emitted by the unknown flying insect must have attracted the ice worms. But, were these unknown flying insects also ice worms? He didn't seem to have heard Li Xiaowen mention them. Xiaohua thought in his heart, but he didn't dare to be negligent. Just now, he had already seen the strange state of the ice worms when they collided with Fu Shu's body. Moreover, Li Xiaowen and the other fourth-layer qi refining cultivators were very afraid, so he didn't dare to let the ice worms get close to him. Xiaohua's eyes swept over and he urged his transcendence energy. His figure quickly flew to the side. At this time, he didn't dare to hold back. His flying speed was several times faster than an 11th-layer qi refining cultivator. Xiaohua didn't move, but the moment he moved, he was immediately discovered by the ice worms. A portion of the ice worms that were originally flying towards the red flying insect also split up and chased after Xiaohua. However, this was only a matter of a moment. Just as Xiaohua flew away, the red flying insect above his head unexpectedly didn't plan on letting him go. It also flapped its membrane-like wings and flew out after Xiaohua's figure. Its speed was unexpectedly not slower than Xiaohua's, and just as the ice worms split up a bit, they immediately merged back into one and chased after Xiaohua. As Xiaohua flew into the valley, he stole glances behind him. He had already seen the situation of the ice worm and the red flying insect. He was slightly alarmed. He had always been confident in his flying speed, but he didn't expect the ice worm and the unknown flying insect to be no slower than him. Looking into the distance, Fu Shu, Fan Daomao, and company were in an even worse state. They kept casting fireball charms in their hands, hoping to use fireballs to block the ice worm's attack. This is bad. Although such a large movement can block the ice worms behind it, and even exterminate some of them, but, there can't be only so few ice worms in the southern color plains, right? If they attracted a large wave of ice worms, how could they pass through this valley? If I were to escape with them, I'm afraid it would be even more dangerous, right? Xiaohua suddenly came to a realization. He originally wanted to fly to the side of the crowd, but his figure unconsciously stopped. Pa! An ice worm flying at the front bumped into the brilliance of Xiaohua's weak water talisman. Just like what Xiaohua saw a moment ago, the brilliance immediately turned into ice. Xiaohua was greatly alarmed. He quickly turned and flew in another direction. At the same time, he stretched out his hand and touched the ice on his body. That ice was different from ordinary ice. It was extremely cold to the touch. Moreover, it was hard, almost as hard as a rock. Xiaohua frowned. He exerted strength in his hand, wanting to crush that ice. However, that ice was slippery and unexpectedly didn't have any effect. Xiaohua pinched it a few times, but it didn't have any effect. In a hurry, Xiaohua took out the magic spear tip from his space without hesitation. He didn't dare to use the spear tip to face himself. Instead, he used the back of the spear tip and used all his strength to hit the ice. Kacha. The ice was shattered. However, it wasn't only the ice that was shattered. The layer of weak water talisman on Xiaohua's body flickered a few times and was also broken at the same time. This. Xiaohua was somewhat depressed. He thought, if I used the weak water talisman to protect my body, I would be turned into ice after being hit by the ice worm. However, if I didn't protect my body, wouldn't my body be frozen into ice after being hit? Should I try the iron cloak talisman? While thinking, he patted his storage pouch and took out another iron cloak talisman. However, he still didn't dare to stop. He flew while thinking. Fortunately, his flying speed was fast enough. Although the ice worm and the unknown flying insect were following closely behind him, Xiaohua's vigilant shuttling back and forth and constantly changing directions made him seem to be somewhat at ease. He was in a much better situation than Fu Shu and the others. Pa! Another sound rang out. An ice worm took advantage of the moment when Xiaohua was turning and hit him. As Xiaohua expected, the iron cloak talisman also couldn't stop the ice worm. At the place where the ice worm hit, the brilliance also turned into ice. I understand. As long as it's spiritual chi of heaven and earth, no matter what attribute it is, as long as the ice worm hits it, it will turn into ice. The spiritual chi of heaven and earth will also turn into ice. Xiaohua was slightly alarmed. He knew that all the defensive yellow talismans in his storage pouch wouldn't be of much use. Perhaps only the fireball talisman would be useful. However, just as Xiaohua was about to take out the fireball talisman, he discovered another strange thing. That unknown red flying insect was flying extremely fast, even faster than Xiaohua by a bit. However, this red flying insect only followed behind Xiaohua and didn't crash into Xiaohua's body. Instead, it was the ice insect that was slower than the red flying insect that was scrambling to catch up to Xiaohua, looking for an opportunity to crash into Xiaohua's body. Why is that? Xiaohua was somewhat puzzled. Could it be that this flying insect is the ice worm's commander? Doesn't it do its own work? While thinking, Xiaohua's mind turned. He changed the fireball talisman in his hand to a confinement talisman. He used his magic power to cover the red flying insect. The red flying insect was also very alert. Without waiting for the confinement talisman to get close, it immediately flew downwards and dodged it in the blink of an eye. On the contrary, the ice worms behind it couldn't dodge in time and were trapped by the confinement talisman. What made Xiaohua even more surprised was that when the ice worms were hit by the confinement talisman, their wings stopped moving. Their antennae also stopped moving. Then, like ice grains, they fell straight down. Little thing. I don't believe that I can't kill you. Xiaohua used the corner of his eye to glance at the red flying insect that had just dodged his confinement talisman and was following behind him again. His heart became ruthless. With a shake of his hand, he took out 4 to 5 confinement talismans from the space. His body suddenly flew up. The red flying insect also paused for a moment before flying up as well. At this moment, Xiaohua shook his hand and several confinement talismans flew out, trapping the red flying insect from all directions. The red flying insect rushed left and right, but in the end, it couldn't dodge Xiaohua's confinement talismans. With a flash of light, the red flying insect was actually hit by several confinement talismans. Its wings struggled a few times, and just like the ice worm just now, it directly fell from the sky. Xiaohua was overjoyed when he saw this. He increased his speed and flew forward. Sure enough, when the red flying insect fell, a portion of the ice worms that were chasing after Xiaohua immediately separated and chased after the red flying insect. Why does it feel a little strange? After Xiaohua finished laughing, a trace of suspicion appeared in his heart. However, before he could think about it carefully, a sharp and urgent sound came from the distant valley. That sound was both loud and urgent, as if it wanted to pierce his ears. Following the sound, the several red flying insects that had scattered in all directions just now, as if they had received some kind of order, all changed directions, and chased after Xiaohua. This was serious. Of the large group of ice worms that appeared just now, about 40% went out to chase after Li Xiaowen and the others. The remaining 60% followed behind the red flying insects. Now that the red flying insects were chasing after Xiaohua, wouldn't that mean that 60% of the ice worms were also chasing after him? Moreover, other than the group of ice worms that was chasing after Xiaohua, the other red flying insects were actually blocking Xiaohua from different directions. Are you kidding me? Xiaohua was a little dumbfounded. He had originally planned to let Li Xiaowen and the others lead the ice worms away. Who would have thought that in the end, he would actually be the one to lead so many ice worms away? Xiaohua whistled, and a trace of excitement appeared in his nervous heart. Xiaohua's figure could be seen flying back and forth amidst the encirclement of many red flying insects. At the beginning, Xiaohua was still a little unfamiliar with it. After being hit by several ice worms, a large piece of the iron cloak talisman was turned into ice. However, Xiaohua was not in a hurry. He did not immediately take out the spear tip. He wanted to wait until the ice had reached a certain degree before breaking it. Just like this, Xiaohua flew in a different direction from the others. He gradually approached the bottom of the valley, and this kind of flying made Xiaohua more and more proficient, more and more comfortable, more and more at ease. What's with that sound just now? How did it come out? It seems to be able to control the red flying insects. Could it be that I was wrong? Once Xiaohua was free, his thoughts turned rapidly. He began to think about that inexplicable sound. It seems, the first time I was discovered by the ice worms, there was also this kind of sound. Moreover, if it wasn't for that sound, Li Xiaowen and the others might not have been discovered. After thinking for a moment, Xiaohua began to pay attention to the pitch-black bottom of the valley. However, the bottom of the valley was very deep. At night, it was impossible to see clearly. Xiaohua's cultivation was insufficient, so he did not dare to go down. He could only be cautious. At the same time, Xiaohua secretly took out a pile of fireball talismans and confinement talismans from the space. He placed the fireball talisman in his left hand, and held the confinement talisman in his right hand. Just like before, after flying for a while, he saw that he was free. With a shake of his hand, several confinement talismans were thrown out. Those red flying insects were admittedly agile, but after all, they could not compare to humans. After doing this several times, there would always be one flying insect that was hit by the confinement talisman and fell from the sky. When the flying insect fell, it also took some ice worms with it. Just after Xiaohua hit 3 more red flying insects, finally, from below Xiaohua, a furious voice sounded. Where did this wild cultivator come from? You actually dare to hurt my fire mushroom insect. Xiaohua was overjoyed when he heard this. He shouted, this young master has been waiting for you. You actually dared to plot against this young master. I'll let you see how powerful this young master is. As he spoke, he did not even look. With a shake of his left hand, more than 10 fireball talismans were activated by magic power. Like hailstones, they shot towards the source of the voice. Chapter 1355. Rumble. With a burst of chaotic sounds, more than 10 fireball talismans exploded under Xiaohua's body, creating a field of fire. The swarm of ice worms was attracted by the flames of the fireball talismans. Unexpectedly, most of the ice worms abandoned Xiaohua and flew towards the bottom of the valley. Xiaohua took the opportunity to fly away for a moment. With a wave of his hand, he threw out several confinement talismans, imprisoning the last few so-called fire bugs. One by one, the fire bugs fell to the bottom of the valley. Then, in a spurt of energy, Xiaohua threw out several fireball talismans, surrounding the few remaining ice worms. Rumble. With a few explosions, many of them were eliminated. Xiaohua had caused such a big commotion, so it naturally attracted the attention of Fu Shu and the others. When they saw the flames around Xiaohua, they all had the same thought as Xiaohua. They urged their magic power and activated their flight talismans. While using fireball talismans and other fire attribute yellow talismans to expel the ice worms, they also tried their best to fly out of the valley. They thought that the further away they were from this place, the safer it would be. Xiaohua coldly looked at the bottom of the valley. He took out a flight talisman from his space and stuck it on his body. Just as he was about to activate it, a black shadow flew out from the bottom of the valley with a whoosh. Its body was still emitting some flames and black smoke. When the black shadow flew close to Xiaohua, Xiaohua could clearly see that it was a cultivator around the 7th level of qi refining. He had a short and stout figure. Originally, he was wearing a neat and tidy Taoist robe, but at this moment, a lot of it had been damaged by the fire. His face was originally plump and his eyebrows were also thick. At this moment, one of his eyebrows was gone, and the other half was still intact. That cultivator stopped in the air and didn't answer. He patted the storage pouch on his waist and took out several yellow talismans. He stuck them on his body, and several water blue lights flashed. Only then did the flickering flames barely extinguish. Looking at the cultivator whose hair was burned, Xiaohua almost wanted to hold his stomach and laugh out loud. Forcefully holding back his laughter, Xiaohua coldly said, "Who is fellow Taoist? You actually drove the ice worms to attack I?" "Humph," the cultivator coldly snorted and slapped his hand. It was the other black pouch on his waist. A pigeon-shaped object flew out from the pouch. The pigeon-shaped object flew in the air and gently circled. The cultivator let out a strange sound from his mouth. It was different from before. When the pigeon-shaped object heard the sound, it flapped its wings twice. A strange light flashed through its eyes. Xiaohua immediately felt like he was being watched. "What is this?" Xiaohua looked at the pigeon and then looked at the black pouch on the cultivator's waist. He was quite puzzled. The pigeon glanced at Xiaohua, flapped its wings, and flew over like lightning. Xiaohua was shocked. He didn't understand what this pigeon was, but since it dared to fly over, it naturally had some tricks up its sleeve. He didn't have any countermeasures, so he clapped his hands and took out several confinement talismans, throwing them at the pigeon. Unexpectedly, the pigeon was very agile. Not only did it not retreat, it actually shuttled back and forth within the range of the confinement talismans, dodging all the yellow talismans. Good heavens, it's so powerful. Xiaohua was somewhat flabbergasted. He didn't have time to take out any yellow talismans from his storage pouch or space. His figure flashed and flew towards the bottom of the valley where the fireball talisman exploded. Needless to say, the pigeon was also closely chasing behind him. Moreover, the pigeon's speed was clearly faster than Xiaohua's. It caught up to Xiaohua in a few breaths of time. Then, without waiting for Xiaohua to turn around, the pigeon crashed into Xiaohua's back with a bang. The ice that was frozen by the ice worms was immediately shattered by the pigeon's crash. Xiaohua also felt a huge force on his back, and his figure unconsciously swayed. This pigeon actually used its body to attack. Xiaohua only now realized. Xiaohua didn't dare to be negligent. He used another iron cloak talisman on his body, and his figure continued to fly downwards. When he was about to reach the bottom of the valley, the ice worms at the place where the fireball talisman exploded had already collided with the non-existent fireballs. With Xiaohua's appearance, the ice worms had a new target. They spread their wings and rushed towards Xiaohua. Seeing this, Xiaohua knew that he had achieved his goal. He didn't stop and turned around, flying towards the sky again. At the same time, Xiaohua waved his hand and took out the devil's spear point from the space. He secretly held it and rushed towards the pigeon. Xiaohua flew fast, but the pigeon flew even faster. In the blink of an eye, the two collided. Xiaohua's eyes narrowed. He looked at where the pigeon came from and thrust his spear forward. Poof! The pigeon that was as fast as lightning stopped in front of Xiaohua's hand. The devil spear point in Xiaohua's hand pierced the pigeon's hard as stone head. As soon as the devil's spear point entered the pigeon's head, a thin black thread immediately sprayed out from the devil's spear point. It quickly circled around the pigeon's body and then retracted back into the devil's spear point. That ferocious pigeon from a moment ago was no longer breathing. Fei Qing, on top of Xiaohua's head, the short and fat cultivator who had been coldly watching Xiaohua's actions all this time suddenly paled. A trace of blood flowed out from the corner of his mouth as he cried out in grief. Humph! When Xiaohua heard this, he shook his hand. That so-called Fei Qing's corpse fell from the sky and fell to the bottom of the valley where the faint light of the flames flickered. It disappeared without a trace. Urgently, Xiaohua didn't seem to give that cultivator any time to react. He shook his hand again and a dozen fireball talismans flew out. Xiaohua could casually refine these things since he had a lot of them in the space. He wasn't stingy at all. Admittedly, Xiaohua didn't have divine sense and couldn't control the fireball talismans very well. However, the fireball talismans won in terms of quantity. In an instant, they enveloped the cultivator's surroundings. The short and fat cultivator clearly didn't expect Xiaohua to be able to take out so many high-grade fireball talismans. A trace of panic appeared on his deathly pale face. At the same time his figure rapidly flew back, he also took out all kinds of yellow talismans. In a flurry, he used them on his body to block the incoming fireballs. Bang! 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 A series of explosions rang out with a world-shaking momentum. Although the southern color plane was extremely cold and the spiritual qi of heaven and earth wasn't much, the fireball talismans Xiaohua refined were still very powerful. They blasted that 7th layer qi refining cultivator until he could only retreat without any ability to counterattack. When Xiaohua saw this, he sneered. He looked at the ice worms under his feet that were already swarming towards the fireball talismans. His figure flashed and circled around that cultivator, preparing to chase after Li Xiaowen and the others who were already out of sight. As soon as Xiaohua flew away, the short and fat cultivator was in a miserable state. He had just been blasted back several meters by the exploding fireball talismans. When he stabilized his body, the already tattered Daoist robe on his body became even more tattered. Before he could take out a new Daoist robe from his storage pouch, a large group of ice worms swarmed over from the bottom of the valley. Pay! The short and fat cultivator fiercely spat out a mouthful of saliva. His figure quickly flew towards the nearest stone wall. The ice worms naturally followed closely behind. Xiaohua flew along the other side of the stone wall while carefully observing. When the short and fat cultivator landed on a protruding part of the stone wall, something happened that made Xiaohua flabbergasted. He saw that cultivator pat his storage pouch and take out a palm-sized triangle. Soon after, he quickly took out a yellow talisman and stuck it on his hand. He used his hand to point at the triangular object. An earthy yellow brilliance rushed out from the triangle and directly covered the cultivator's body. Suddenly, a layer of rock-like things appeared around the cultivator's body. In the blink of an eye, the cultivator was completely covered. That cultivator actually turned into a rock. The swarm of ice worms flew to the side of the rock and circled around a few times. They didn't stop and flew towards Xiaohua's direction. Magic tool. When Xiaohua saw this, he sighed in his heart and almost cried out in alarm. He didn't quite understand. It was said that this magic tool could only be used after one had divine sense. This short and fat cultivator's cultivation was only around the 7th layer of qi refining. How could he use a magic tool? Moreover, what was that pitch-black pouch on the cultivator's waist? What fetching could actually fly out from it? Seeing that the ice worms were flying towards him, Xiaohua wasn't too nervous. His flying speed was about the same as the ice worms. As long as he threw out a fireball talisman, it would naturally attract the ice worms to one side and he would be able to calmly escape. But when Xiaohua's heart relaxed a little, his gaze swept past the stone wall beside him. There was also a protrusion there, and there was also a piece of rock on top of the protrusion. It can't be someone who was with that cultivator, right? Just as this thought arose in Xiaohua's heart, the rock suddenly moved. A cultivator who looked similar to the short and fat cultivator from before appeared from the cover. Without saying anything, he threw a yellow talisman at Xiaohua's face. That talisman was the commonly seen confinement talisman. After it hit Xiaohua's body, Xiaohua's entire body was tightly confined and he couldn't move in the slightest. Just like the ice worms from before, he fell straight to the bottom of the valley. If he fell from such a high height, he would definitely end up in a bloody mess. There was no other possibility. Therefore, after the cultivator threw out the confinement talisman and saw Xiaohua fall, he didn't chase after him. He glanced at the ice worms that were already flying close and crouched down. Using some unknown method, his entire body turned into a rock, looking exactly like the cultivator in front of him. However, just as that cultivator turned into a rock, a figure suddenly flew out from under the stone wall. With lightning speed, he stretched out his hand and a jet-black brilliance followed that person's hand and quietly pierced into the rock. Ah! A blood-curdling scream sounded from the rock. The entire rock gradually transformed into a short and fat cultivator. That cultivator lowered his head and looked at the black spear point in his chest in disbelief. That spear point had already pierced deeply into his chest, but there wasn't a trace of blood around the spear point. Soon after, that cultivator's gaze fell on Xiaohua, who had broken free from the confinement talisman and immediately flew up the stone wall to attack him. Chapter 1356. That cultivator really couldn't figure out how this rogue cultivator, who was only at the second level of qi condensation, managed to break free from the confinement talisman. Even more so, he couldn't believe that the spear tip in this rogue cultivator's hand actually possessed unparalleled strength. Not only did it penetrate his defense, it even shattered the restriction on his Taoist robe, causing him, a 7th-level qi condensation cultivator, to unexpectedly die in the hands of a rogue cultivator at the 2nd level of qi condensation. The devil spear pierced the cultivator's chest. Similarly, a black thread flashed by, extinguishing the cultivator's life force. Immediately after, without waiting for Xiaohua to withdraw his hand, a series of pa-pa-pa sounds rang out. The ice worms flying at the front had already collided with Xiaohua's body. On Xiaohua's back, the brilliance of the weak water talisman gradually solidified. Immediately after, pa-pa-pa-pa-pa sounds rang out continuously. It seemed that in just a split second, Xiaohua's back had turned into a block of ice. Turning his head to look at the hundreds and thousands of ice worms, Xiaohua's heart gave birth to a burst of panic. That panic was like a gale, completely expelling the joy of killing the enemy. Only a single word, as firm as a boulder, remained in his heart: run. Only now did Xiaohua understand why the cultivators of the country of Xi were so afraid of the southern calling, and why they only dared to pass through at night. Just now, hundreds and thousands of ice worms were already enough to make Xiaohua, whose flying speed was close to the 11th level of qi condensation, flustered. If the number was even greater, wouldn't it be strange if he wasn't turned into an icicle by the ice worms? Xiaohua didn't dare to be negligent. While rapidly chasing after Li Xiaowen and the others, he held the devil's spear tip in his hand and struck his own back with it. With a crash, the spear tip smashed the block of ice, and the iron cloak talisman was also broken. Immediately after, Xiaohua stored the devil's spear tip into his space and applied an iron cloak talisman to himself. While Xiaohua was running for his life, he didn't forget to look at the cultivator who had just transformed into a rock. As Xiao Hua expected, the short and fat cultivator who had just turned into a rock had already heard his junior brother's screams and came out of the rock. At this moment, he was looking at Xiao Hua with a sinister expression. However, there were many ice worms between Xiao Hua and the cultivator, causing the cultivator to hesitate. When Xiao Hua saw that the two of them were wearing the same clothes and their faces were also the same, he already knew he had a great enmity with this person. Moreover, this person was a 7th-layer aura refining cultivator. Compared to him, the difference between them was really too great. If he didn't run now, when would he? Thus, Xiao Hua urged his magic power and poured it all into the flying talisman. His whole body was like the wind, flying forward at extreme speed. Behind him, thousands of ice worms also surged and chased after him. When the cultivator saw Xiao Hua fly away, a trace of amazement appeared on his face. However, in an instant, it turned into a sneer. Because he had returned to his original form, more than 10 ice worms had turned around to look for him. The cultivator didn't panic. He clenched his teeth, slapped his storage pouch, and took out a somewhat strange yellow talisman. The yellow talisman's color was somewhat faint, and the talisman's runes were already somewhat indistinct. However, when the cultivator held it in his hand, he slightly urged his magic power and actually drew in a large amount of the surrounding spiritual energy. When the yellow talisman turned into an orange brilliance, the cultivator placed his hand on his shoulder. The brilliance of the yellow talisman flashed and disappeared in a flash, repeatedly rippling around the cultivator's body. The brilliance of the yellow talisman was stable, and a layer of earthy yellow, like a Taoist robe, appeared around the cultivator's body. This earthy yellow film was also very strange. As soon as it appeared, the dozen ice worms seemed to have lost track of the cultivator and stopped about 1 zhang in front of him. Then, the dozen ice worms slightly circled around, spread their wings, and flew away. Seeing the ice worm fly away, the cultivator's face didn't show any joy or anger. He flew up and flew towards the opposite stone wall. At this moment, there was only the corpse of the cultivator killed by Xiao Hua's surprise attack. Because the corpse had just died, it was still warm. Most of its body had already been turned into ice by the ice worm. The short and fat cultivator looked around and his gaze fell on the corpse's waist. There were also 2 different bags of holding there. Fortunately, only a small portion of the 2 bags of holding were sealed in ice. The cultivator didn't hesitate to take the bag of holding and put it on his waist. Then he took out a dark red triangular talisman and activated it with his magic power. The talisman turned into a drop of blood. The cultivator spat out a mouthful of blood essence on the talisman. The talisman lit up like a torch and the light suddenly increased. The cultivator's expression was a bit hesitant, but when his gaze fell on the corpse under his feet, the hesitation disappeared. The cultivator clenched his teeth and hit the light on his chest. When the light entered his chest, the cultivator's face became inexplicably red. Then, the cultivator slapped his bag of holding and took out a shuttle-shaped object. He threw it into the air and formed a strange seal with his hand. The cultivator's face became even redder and the shuttle-shaped object turned into a shuttle. The short and stout cultivator extended his hand and tossed the corpse on the ground onto the shuttle. He himself also leapt onto the shuttle. Immediately after, under the urging of the cultivator's magic power, the shuttle rapidly chased after Xiao Hua. Its speed was actually a fraction faster than Xiao Hua's. Xiao Hua gathered his magic power and flew out of the valley. His speed was originally a bit faster than the ice worms. Now that he was desperately escaping, he left behind a lot of ice worms. However, after flying for the time it took to drink a cup of tea, he still hadn't reached the end of the valley. Instead, 2 different valleys appeared in front of him, each leading to a different place. This is bad, Xiao Hua's heart was beating fast. With the speed of Li Xiaowen and the others, they must have just passed by. But, if he couldn't find the right direction, wouldn't he be going in the opposite direction? However, this wasn't the time for Xiao Hua to hesitate. The entrances of the two valleys were the same. He couldn't distinguish anything. Xiaohua only had a thought and flew to the left. Xiaohua followed the ice worms behind him and just entered the valley on the left. The short and fat cultivator's shuttle caught up. The cultivator seemed to be very familiar with the south color plane. Seeing Xiaohua enter the valley on the left, his dark red face showed a trace of pleasant surprise. However, after the pleasant surprise, he slightly frowned, as if he was afraid of something. The shuttle under his feet also stopped. The short and fat cultivator's face was gloomy. It was unknown what he was thinking, but he didn't dare to chase into the valley. It seemed like he was making a decision. The cultivator stood in the air like this for no less than the time it took to drink a cup of tea. When the cultivator's eyebrows relaxed and he was about to take the next step, a series of rumbling sounds came from the valley on the left. Behind the rumbling sounds, there was an even louder sound of tides and waves crashing against the shore. The short and fat cultivator's face showed panic. Just as he was about to urge the shuttle to turn around, another unforgettable figure came out from the valley. Without hesitation, the cultivator slapped his storage bag and took out the triangular magic tool from before. He pointed his finger and a yellow light flew into the air. It turned into a ring and flew towards the figure. As for Xiaohua, he flew into the valley on the left. As soon as he entered, he felt that the valley was a bit colder than outside. His eyebrows and hair quickly formed some white ice flowers. Could it be that I went the wrong way? Xiaohua was a bit apprehensive. He raised his head and looked around. This valley was the same as the south color plain. The walls were covered in a layer of ice. Occasionally, there would be some white flowers on the ice as well as some strange-looking spirit herbs. At this time, the full moon had already set and the moonlight was dim. Everything in the valley was deathly pale. After flying for a while, the stone walls gradually changed. Many holes appeared. These holes were densely packed and filled the entire stone wall. It looked like the entire stone wall was turning black. Wrong, this is definitely wrong. Xiaohua was a bit alarmed. If this valley was right, I should have caught up with Li Xiaowen and the others. Since I haven't caught up with them, it must be wrong. Thinking about this, Xiaohua wanted to turn around and go back. However, there were still thousands of ice worms chasing him. Xiaohua had no choice but to dive down and try to go around these ice worms. Just as he flew down about 10 feet, an extremely cold and weak divine sense swept over from below him. A Foundation establishment cultivator? Xiaohua was shocked. However, he immediately felt that something was wrong. This divine sense was extremely stiff and emotionless. When it swept over him, it was like a block of ice. Could it be? Xiaohua didn't dare to think further. At the same time, he didn't dare to fly down anymore. Looking at the ice worms blocking his way, he clenched his teeth and took out a stack of fireball talismans. He shook his hand and threw them out. Rumble. A loud sound rang out. It actually exploded into a blank area. Xiaohua didn't say anything else. He braced himself and wanted to fly away from that blank area. At this moment, with a hua sound, a surge of energy came from below him. An extremely cold aura quickly attacked Xiaohua's surroundings. Run! Xiaohua was shocked. He felt that his body was about to be frozen stiff. He hurriedly rushed out. The cold aura swept over like a wind and spread around the valley. After Xiaohua flew a few feet, he shockingly discovered that ice worms were flying out of the numerous holes in the stone wall. In just a few breaths, the ice worms filled the entire valley. Xiaohua glanced at them. Wasn't there tens of thousands of ice worms? Xiaohua didn't dare to hold anything back. Fireball talismans, fire serpent talismans, fire net talismans, and all the other fire-type talismans were thrown out one after another. A series of rumbling sounds rang out, blasting open a blank area in front of the ice worms. Just as Xiaohua emerged from this blank area, behind him, a giant ice worm king the size of a head and its entire body was transparent. It was several hundred times larger than an ordinary ice worm. The ice worm king had 8 tentacles that were as thick as fingers and about a foot long. They swayed slightly in the air, and the ice worm king's wings flapped rapidly. Every time they flapped, there would be a sound like a tidal wave. Chapter 1357. Following the ice worm king's tide-like sound, all the surrounding ice worms chased after Xiaohua. These tens of thousands of ice worms fluttered in the air, creating a sound similar to a tidal wave crashing against the shore. This wasn't the most frightening thing. The most frightening thing was that behind Xiaohua, the ice worm king actually chased after him. Its speed wasn't slower than Xiaohua's, it was even faster. How could Xiaohua have time to look back? Just these tens of thousands of ice worms were enough to take his life, not to mention the ice worm king that actually had spiritual sense. Xiaohua exerted all his strength and tried his best to fly out of the canyon. But as soon as Xiaohua flew out of the canyon, an earthen yellow brilliance descended from the sky and wrapped around his body. Xiaohua's eyes swept over and saw the short and fat cultivator on the shuttle. He secretly complained in his heart, "This is what it means to have a wolf in front and a tiger behind." Fortunately, he still had fireball talismans in his hand. With a wave of his hand, several fireball talismans flew into the air and exploded towards the earthen yellow ring. Peng, peng, peng. Several fireball talismans exploded, and sparks flew everywhere. Unfortunately, the ring did not explode into pieces like Xiaohua had imagined. It was so much so that the speed of the ring's descent was not affected at all. Xiaohua's fireball talismans only caused the ring to sway slightly. AI, is this the difference between magic tools and yellow talismans? Is this the difference between a second-layer qi refining cultivator and a seventh-layer qi refining cultivator? Xiaohua already saw the triangle in the short and fat cultivator's hand and couldn't help but sigh. At the same time, he also secretly felt lucky that he was able to kill another 7th-level qi refining cultivator. Seeing that the fireball talismans were ineffective, Xiaohua didn't have any more tricks up his sleeve. With a wave of his hand, he threw a fire net talisman into the air. A fire net blocked the bottom of the ring, and he quickly flew towards the short and fat cultivator's shuttle. That cultivator had already guessed Xiaohua's intentions. With a wave of his hand, several confinement talismans also flew towards Xiaohua. At the same time, the shuttle under his feet flew out several feet, increasing the distance between him and Xiaohua. Sigh, Xiaohua sighed. He shot out several more fireball talismans, blowing away the oncoming confinement talismans. Seeing the short and fat cultivator pulling away from him, he knew that his usual trick had already been seen through. In the air, the descending ring had already arrived above Xiaohua's head. Xiaohua's fire net talisman was only able to block it for a moment before it was completely crushed by the ring. It continued to fall without stopping, smashing towards Xiaohua. Xiaohua sighed and hurriedly flew to the side, trying in vain to dodge the ring. Unfortunately, this ring was not a yellow talisman. Under the control of the short and fat cultivator, its speed was not something that Xiaohua could dodge. Xiaohua had just flown a meter or so away when the ring came down on him. Seeing that the ring had arrived above his head, Xiaohua waved his hand and took out the devil's spear. He was about to stab the ring above his head, but at the same time the ring fell, the Ice Worm King also chased out of the canyon. As soon as the Ice Worm King came out of the canyon, its cold divine sense swept out again. Seeing 2 cultivators, the Ice Worm King's 8 antennae rapidly swayed. An extremely cold spiritual energy was generated from the Ice Worm King's antennae, and then it split into 2 and shot towards Xiaohua and the short and fat cultivator. The ring fell on top of Xiaohua's head and directly wrapped around him. Xiaohua's demonic spear simply pierced empty air. Immediately after, the ring shook above Xiaohua's head and transformed into an earthen yellow circle, covering Xiaohua inside. Xiaohua felt as if his whole body was being pressed down by a huge force, unable to move in the slightest. Next, the earthen yellow circle entered Xiaohua's body and tightly wrapped around him. It was several times harder than a confinement talisman. Not only that, when Xiaohua was hit by the short and fat cultivator's magic weapon, the Ice Worm King's extremely cold spiritual energy also attacked. In an instant, Xiaohua's whole body was condensed into a layer of frost. Moreover, the frost was condensing from the outside to the inside. Not only the yellow circle that the short and fat cultivator used to attack Xiaohua, but also Xiaohua's own defensive iron cloak talisman, they were all condensed into a solid layer of ice. Xiaohua was like an icicle, falling straight down into the pitch-black bottom of the canyon. Seeing that Xiaohua had been hit by his Dharma treasure and the Ice Worm King's spirit chi and had fallen into the air, the short and fat cultivator's face lit up with joy. However, before his joy could fully emerge, the Ice Worm King's spirit chi attacked him. The short and fat cultivator could only freeze the joy on his face. He urged the shuttle under his feet to flee far away, wanting to escape from this canyon. While he was fleeing, he didn't forget to urge the magic weapon in his hand. Another ring flew out from the magic weapon and struck horizontally at the Ice Worm King, wanting to stop it. The Ice Worm King's wings flapped, and the sound of tides rose again. All the ice worms flew out of the canyon, chasing after the short and fat cultivator. At the same time, they also chased in the direction that Li Xiaowen and the others had fled. As for the Ice Worm King, it didn't care about the ring flying horizontally at all. It flew straight up and crashed into the ring. With a crack, the ring hit the Ice Worm King's body. Before the ring could turn into a circle, it was frozen into a block of ice by the Ice Worm King's extreme cold. After being hit by the Ice Worm King, it turned into ice shards and fell into the air. The Ice Worm King's antennae swayed slightly, but its skull-sized body didn't stop at all. It was faster than the short and fat cultivator's shuttle and chased out of the canyon. In the night sky, the slanting full moon poured its bright light onto the Ice Worm King's body. Very little of the moonlight dissipated, but most of it was absorbed by the Ice Worm King's body. Xiaohua was hit by the Ice Worm King's extreme cold. His entire body was frozen solid, and he fell from the sky. The layer of ice frozen by the Ice Worm King was different from ordinary ice worms. Inside the layer of ice, Xiaohua felt a bone-piercing cold seeping into his body bit by bit, as if trying to freeze every inch of his body. He knew that if this cold seeped into his body, he would be completely turned into a block of ice. Not only would he be unable to move his hands and feet, even his true chi would be frozen. Whatever magic power and other things would be unable to flow. Therefore, in his panic, Xiaohua immediately used his Heart Sutra to move the true chi in his meridians bit by bit with difficulty, hoping to force the extreme cold out of his body. Just as Xiaohua was silently circulating his Heart Sutra, a loud bang resounded. It was as if an ice cube had crashed into another ice cube. Xiaohua fell to the ground. Around him were icicles that fell to the ground from the air. The huge impact shook Xiaohua until he was dizzy. The true qi in his body was almost out of breath. While Xiaohua was dizzy, he immediately focused his mind and tried to move his true qi, hoping to pull himself out of the jaws of death. It was the same as Xiaohua's usual nighttime cultivation. However, at this time, he couldn't sit cross-legged nor could he close his eyes. The reverse light in the space behind Xiaohua's head stopped rotating. Countless different starlight descended from the sky, wrapping around Xiaohua and the blocks of ice around him. Those blocks of ice were admittedly extremely cold and thick, but they couldn't prevent Xiaohua from absorbing the starlight at all. In the night sky, the full moon that had already descended had an extremely strange trace of brilliance falling on Xiaohua's body. Like the other starlight, it was absorbed by Xiaohua. Following the absorption of the starlight, inside Xiaohua's body, inside his bones and flesh, there were 132 mysterious dots that emitted pitch-black flames. As soon as these pitch-black flames appeared, they immediately began to swallow the different starlight that had seeped into Xiaohua's body. After the starlight was absorbed, the pitch-black flames didn't change at all, but the extreme cold that had invaded Xiaohua's body was already stopped. Moreover, as time passed, the ice on the surface of Xiaohua's body actually gradually melted. The true qi in Xiaohua's meridians also slowly accelerated. After an unknown amount of time, Xiaohua gradually woke up from his unconscious state. The true qi in his body had already returned to normal and he could feel his hands and feet. However, because Xiaohua was awake, the different starlight had already disappeared and the reverse light had also begun to mysteriously rotate. Xiaohua checked for a bit and knew that the cold air had already been forced out of his body by the circulating true qi. Moreover, because of the forced circulation of true qi, his magic power had actually increased to a certain extent. This is actually a good place to cultivate. Xiaohua was pleasantly surprised and couldn't help but think to himself. Then, Xiaohua's arms exerted strength and the tip of the demonic spear in his hand pierced outwards with all his strength. Ka! There was a slight sound at the tip of the spear, but Xiaohua's body didn't break free as easily as before. This Ice Worm King is really powerful. Xiaohua's heart still had lingering fear. He once again exerted 120% of his strength and exerted all his strength to struggle. After the time it took to eat a meal and who knows how many times he tried, Xiaohua finally broke the ice on his arms and legs and broke free from it. Looking at the other parts of his body that were covered in ice, Xiaohua picked up the tip of the spear and began to randomly poke. Unfortunately, the effect was limited. Immediately after, Xiaohua took out the fireball talisman and wanted to try using a fireball. However, after thinking for a moment, he gave up. Not only was he afraid of injuring himself, he was even more afraid of attracting the Ice Worm King again. In the end, Xiaohua once again used the tip of the spear to poke outwards from the inside for who knows how long before the ice on his body was completely shattered. Where is this place? Xiaohua broke free from the ice and only now had the mind to look around. Huh? What is this? Xiaohua looked around and his gaze fell on his feet. Under his feet was a transparent layer of ice. Following the faint reflection of the ice on the stone walls, Xiaohua saw that there were many black things in the ice. When he squatted down and looked carefully, he couldn't help but jump in fright. Those black things were actually lifelike people. When he looked carefully, Xiaohua couldn't help but feel his hair stand on end. This was because every human figure in the ice had a frightened expression on their faces. Every one of their movements was not one that wasn't struggling, but every one of their eyes was filled with despair. Sigh, these people are probably the same as me. They encountered the Ice Worm King and were sealed in ice by the Ice Worm King. After a long time, they turned into a big block of ice. If I didn't break free today, wouldn't I end up like them? Sealed under this layer of ice with them? Xiaohua thought. Then he saw the storage pouches on these people's waists and some magic tools in their hands. Xiaohua's heart stirred. He picked up the tip of the spear and began to chisel at the ice under his feet. Chapter 1358. Xiaohua's arms had the strength of 10,000 jin. Coupled with the sharp tip of the demonic spear, this was his secret technique to break through with force. However, at this moment, it had no effect. Xiaohua didn't know what the Ice Worm King's extremely cold aura was, but the layer of ice it formed was actually so sturdy. Xiaohua tried a few times, but he couldn't even leave a mark on the surface of the layer of ice, let alone break the layer of ice and take out the storage bag inside. Xiaohua was somewhat disappointed, but there was nothing he could do. Looking at the gradually darkening night sky, he knew that the full moon had already set. It was the darkness before dawn. If he didn't take advantage of this time to escape from the South Kai Ping, when the sun rose, all the ice worms would come out and he would die without a burial place. Therefore, Xiaohua took out a flight talisman and stuck it on his body. His body flew lightly, and after looking at the direction, he was about to fly towards the canyon. At this moment, Xiaohua's gaze landed on the canyon where the Ice Worm King had chased from. In the darkness, there was actually a faint light. Although the light was far away, Xiaohua could see it very clearly. It was faint like a pile of fireflies. What is that? Could it be some kind of treasure? Xiaohua's heart was moved. He thought of what Li Xiaowen and the others said. There were some uncommon spiritual herbs in the South Kai Ping, which attracted cultivators to take the risk. The Ice Worm King should have already chased out of the canyon. I'm afraid it's killing that short and fat cultivator. Moreover, the ice worms in the canyon have all followed the Ice Worm King. At this moment, the nest should be empty. Since this young master suffered a big loss here and almost lost his life, how could he not take some treasures to calm himself down? Xiaohua thought to himself. He took out a stack of fireball talismans from his bosom and landed on the ground. Sticking close to the ice at the bottom of the canyon, he quietly flew towards the light. Contrary to Xiaohua's expectations, the light seemed very close, but it actually flew very far. Moreover, along the way, he only saw corpses in the ice from time to time. Other than that, there were some strange spiritual fruits growing in the ice. As for the ice worms and the like, there wasn't even half of them. Xiaohua knew that the layer of ice was hard, so those rare and precious spirit fruits were unable to be transplanted into his space. He could only pluck the fruits from the ice. Before he even reached the place where the light shone, he had already plucked more than a dozen icy fruits of various sizes and colors. When Xiaohua arrived in front of the light, he couldn't help but feel disappointed. That thing was the size of an egg, and there were still some flaws on it. That light seemed to be absorbed from the full moon in the night sky. At this moment, as the full moon fell, the light had already dimmed. What is this? What is it for? Xiaohua stood at the side with some hesitation. Although he was standing there, he could clearly feel that it was much colder than before. He knew that this coldness came from this egg-like thing, but he still didn't know what this thing was for. Forget it, let's just take it first and talk about it later. Xiaohua had always been the type of person who would rather take the wrong thing than let it go. How could he return empty-handed? Just as Xiaohua bent down and reached out to grab it, the sound of something breaking through the air suddenly rang out in the silent canyon. Someone's there. Xiaohua stared blankly and became vigilant. At this moment, other than the faint light coming from the egg, everything else was pitch black. He couldn't see any hiding place. Xiaohua didn't have time to look back. His eyes turned slightly and saw a groove next to the ice layer next to the egg. Without thinking, he laid down on his back. At the same time, he also grasped the tip of the demonic spear in his hand. The night was pitch black, so he wasn't afraid that someone would see clearly. Xiaohua had just laid down when the sound of flying came closer. Listening to the sound, it was coming towards the egg. Could it be that short and fat cultivator from before? Xiaohua laid there, not daring to move in the slightest. Only his eyes were left spinning. Li Xiaowen, Fu Shu, and the others should have already escaped from the southern color plain. How could they dare to come back? Moreover, those two short and fat cultivators came early in the morning. Those red worms were also theirs. They should have been used to lure the Ice Worm King. Their goal should be this egg-like thing. Xiaohua immediately understood. Those two short and fat cultivators had come early in the morning and arranged everything to lure the Ice Worm King out. However, his group of 6 had disrupted their plans, so the short and fat cultivator had the intention to kill them. Just as he was thinking, that cultivator had already arrived next to the egg. Borrowing the dim light of the egg, Xiaohua could already see the cultivator's figure. It was indeed short and fat. Moreover, that cultivator's Taoist robe was damaged and his hair was covered in ice. It seemed that it was extremely difficult for him to escape from the Ice Worm King's attack. This guy's methods are quite good. A 7th layer Qi refining cultivator was actually able to dodge the attack of the Ice Worm King, which is comparable to a foundation establishment cultivator. Xiaohua thought with some amazement. Although the cultivator was close to the egg, he was still cautious and didn't rush to pick it up. First, he placed a yellow talisman on his body, then 2 more on his left and right hands. Next, he tilted his head and listened carefully. At this time, apart from the light of the egg, the entire canyon was pitch black. The short and fat cultivator simply couldn't see Xiaohua lying on the ground. After a while, seeing that there was nothing else around him, the short and fat cultivator leaned over and took the egg in his hand. It seemed to be extremely cold. The cultivator's hands were trembling. Borrowing the faint light of the egg, Xiaohua could clearly see the cultivator's expression of extreme surprise and joy. Hee, the Ice Worm King's egg. I finally got it. Although it's a bit lacking, but it's enough. I have hope of reaching foundation establishment. The cultivator couldn't help but mutter to himself. Then he clapped his hands and put the egg into the pitch-black storage pouch at his waist. Humph, if it weren't for those rogue cultivators, I'm afraid I wouldn't have succeeded so easily. However, Junior Marshall Brothers' life wouldn't have been lost here. Those rogue cultivators are really hateful. The short and fat cultivator slapped his storage pouch and took out a flying talisman. He stuck it on his body and urged his transcendence energy to fly away. Just as his feet left the ground, Xiaohua's figure suddenly flew out from the ice trough and shot towards the short and fat cultivator like an arrow. The short and fat cultivator was originally extremely vigilant. But after easily obtaining the Ice Worm King's egg, he knew that there was no danger nearby. He was overjoyed and inevitably relaxed. Moreover, he was already flying, so he was even more unguarded. Xiaohua's sneak attack was just perfect. Ah! Who is it? The short and fat cultivator heard the movement and immediately slapped his storage pouch. However, Xiaohua was very close to him and Xiaohua's flying speed was comparable to an 11th layer Qi refining cultivator. In such a short distance, Xiaohua was scheming against the short and fat cultivator. How could the short and fat cultivator have time to resist? Kacha, a crisp sound rang out. Under Xiaohua's enormous strength, the devil's spear tip had already pierced through the short and fat cultivator's defense. Immediately after, with a puchi sound, the spear tip pierced deeply into the cultivator's back. Just like how it killed the other person just now, the black qi on the spear tip wrapped around the cultivator's heart and the cultivator's vitality was completely gone. A pitiful 7th layer qi refining cultivator, under Xiaohua's close-range attack, simply didn't have the strength to fight back. Unexpectedly, he didn't even turn his head and died tragically under the devil's spear tip. Even at death's door, he didn't know who killed him. After killing the short and fat cultivator, Xiaohua's heart finally relaxed. With a shake of the spear tip, the short and fat cultivator's corpse was thrown onto the ice. Looking at the 3 storage pouches on the cultivator's body, Xiaohua unhesitatingly opened them. When he opened them, he saw that of the 2 pitch-black storage pouches, only one contained the Ice Worm King's egg that he just put in. The other was completely empty. As for the seemingly ordinary storage pouch, apart from the triangular magic tool, there were some high and mid-grade spirit stones, as well as many yellow talismans and a small booklet. Then, Xiaohua joyfully took out the booklet and the Ice Worm King's egg. When he looked at it in the nearly empty light, he saw that the booklet was followed by the insect scripture, but it wasn't a cultivation method. Bad luck. Xiaohua sighed. These cultivators, why didn't they put the cultivation method in their storage pouches? They really made this young master work for nothing. Saying this, Xiaohua casually threw the booklet and the Ice Worm King's egg into his own space. Then, he took everything else from the storage pouch into his own space. With a wave of his hand, he was about to throw the 3 storage bags to the ground. However, on second thought, he remembered that these storage bags represented supreme-grade spirit stones. It would be a pity to throw them away for no reason. With that thought, he put the storage bags into his sleeve. Afterwards, Xiaohua didn't dare to delay any longer. His figure flew up and flew towards the other side of the canyon. After entering the other side of the canyon, he flew for another pipe of smoke. The sky gradually brightened and 2 more canyons appeared in the canyon. Where should I go? Xiaohua scratched his ears and cheeks. He was most afraid of this kind of fork in the road. How could I forget? Xiaohua slapped his forehead and remembered the consecutive note talisman that Li Xiaowen gave everyone before entering the southern Kaiping. Wasn't that the consecutive note talisman supposed to be used at this time? Xiaohua quickly took out the consecutive note talisman and urged it with his magic power. The consecutive note talisman actually let out a soft whistle and circled in the air before flying towards the canyon on the left at extreme speed. Little ancestor, can you not scream? Hearing the sound, Xiaohua was greatly shocked. He was really afraid that this sound would attract the Ice Worm King. That was a strength comparable to a foundation establishment cultivator. It was far from something Xiaohua could resist. Xiaohua urged the flight talisman and closely chased after the sharp whistle, flying through the twists and turns of the canyon. Early in the morning, Xiaohua's luck really exploded. In the time it took to eat a meal, he didn't know how many twists and turns he took, but Xiaohua actually didn't encounter a single ice worm, let alone the Ice Worm King. Hearing the sharp whistle in front of him stop, the canyon in front of him suddenly opened up. Xiaohua understood that he had most likely passed through the southern Kaiping. Sure enough, a surprised voice sounded from the foothills in the distance. Fellow Taoist Yong, is that you? Fellow Taoist Yong. Yong Shang. Xiaohua was stunned. Soon after, he slowed down his flying speed and said in a clear voice, which fellow Taoist in front? I am Xiaohua. Ah. Fellow Taoist Xiao. You, how did you escape? Xiaohua heard the voice in front of him. It was Fan Dao Mao. Chapter 1359. That's strange. Fellow Taoist Fan, could it be that only you could escape, and I should be buried in the South Kaiping? When Xiaohua saw Fan Dao Mao, he felt relaxed. Although he said so, he had a smile on his face. Not at all, not at all. Fan Dao Mao was embarrassed. He cupped his hands and said, Fellow Taoist Xiao, please don't blame us. Fellow Taoist was besieged by the ice worms at the beginning, and was also ambushed by the disciples of the Black Spirit sect. We thought that even with our cultivation, it would be difficult to escape. He, fellow Taoist Xiao. I'm afraid that it bodes ill rather than well. Fellow Taoist Xiao. As they spoke, 3 people flew from the foot of the mountain. They were Li Xiaowen, Fu Shu, Sun Fian, and only Yong Shang was missing. Greetings, fellow Taoists. I was lucky to escape with my life. Xiaohua cupped his hands and greeted. Not bad, not bad. Li Xiaowen returned the greeting and said, in such a dangerous situation, fellow Taoist Xiao was actually able to escape, very good. Then, he looked around and said, fellow Taoist Xiao, you also saw the situation last night. In the ice worm swarm, we couldn't even take care of ourselves, so it was difficult for us to help you. Please forgive us. Xiaohua shook his head and said with a smile, I already said last night that in the South Kaiping, I will be careful. If there is any accident, I won't dare to implicate you. Whether I stay in the valley or escape outside, it's I's business. It's not your fault. Then, he looked around and asked with concern, that fellow Taoist Yong, did you stay in the valley? Li Xiaowen smiled bitterly and told him what happened. It turned out that after Li Xiaowen and the other four were discovered by the ice worms, they tried their best to escape. However, their flying speed was not as good as the ice worms, and they were not as skillful as Xiaohua. Therefore, they could only rely on the yellow talismans in their storage bags to disperse the ice worms while trying their best to escape from the valley. In that situation, no one had the time to look at each other. When they escaped from the South Kaiping, they found that Xiaohua and Yongsheng were missing. There was no need to talk about Xiaohua. When they were escaping from the southern Kaiping, they had already seen Xiaohua throw out an incomparably powerful fireball talisman and be besieged by a swarm of ice worms. In their impression, with Xiaohua's cultivation, there was no way he could survive. But what about Yongsheng? Based on everyone's memories, it seemed that Yongsheng had followed behind them and escaped together. As for where and when he disappeared, no one knew. Although the four of them managed to escape with their lives, which could be considered a great fortune, but another problem appeared. Apart from Fan Daomao's silk bag, which had already been used, Xiaohua and Yongsheng's silk bags had not been used. Without these two people's silk bags, no one would know where the final location would be, and the so-called cultivation technique and treasure would naturally be hopeless. Actually, when they saw Xiaohua being besieged by the ice worms, they had already somewhat given up in their hearts. However, the four of them still waited here, hoping that after Fan Daomao came out, the five of them would discuss what to do. But what shocked them was that the one who came out wasn't Fan Daomao, but Xiaohua, who they thought had long been frozen into an icicle. Spirit Husbandry Sect. When Xiaohua heard Li Xiaowen's description, he couldn't help but be stunned. He asked curiously, those two short and fat cultivators were from Spirit Husbandry Sect? Two Spirit Husbandry Sect disciples. Fu Shu asked curiously, not just one. Oh, that's right. When Xiaohua heard this, he knew that he had let it slip. When he was ambushed by the second Spirit Husbandry Sect disciple, Li Xiaowen and the rest had already escaped. What they saw was only the first Spirit Husbandry Sect disciple. Xiaohua rolled his eyes and said with a smile, when I escaped from the southern color plane, I saw the cultivator who controlled the red flying insects and the other short and fat cultivator being frozen in the icicle. That's how I knew that they were two Spirit Husbandry Sect disciples. I see. Fu Shu nodded slightly. That's right, fellow Taoist Xiao. Sun Fian, who had been silent all this while, said in a low voice, that fellow Taoist, when you passed by the two Spirit Husbandry Sect disciples, did you see a black spirit storage bag? Spirit storage bag? Xiaohua rolled his eyes and said with a smile, why is fellow Taoist Sun asking this? After hearing Xiaohua's words, not only did Sun Fian's eyes light up, even Li Xiaowen, Fu Shu, and Fan Daomao's eyes widened. Looks like fellow Taoist Xiao has seen this spirit storage bag before. Li Xiaowen said with a smile. He, fellow Taoist Li, are you also interested in this spirit storage bag? Xiaohua asked ambiguously. Sun Fian changed from his previous wooden expression and said first, of course, a spirit storage bag is the foundation of carrying spiritual items, just like a spirit storage bag. It's just that a spirit storage bag is even more precious than a spirit storage bag. In the country of Shi, only the Spirit Husbandry Sect and a few other sects that rear spiritual items have spirit storage bags. The other sects don't have them. I have always wanted to carry spiritual items, but I never had the chance to get one. So, if it's convenient for fellow Taoist Xiao to transfer it to this. Xiaohua knew the use of the spirit storage bag and already understood where the red flying insects and pigeons came from. But he still faintly felt that there was something inappropriate about it. Seeing Xiaohua hesitate, Sun Fian was even more certain of Xiao Hua's thoughts and said anxiously, "Fellow Taoist Xiao, I am willing to offer 20, no, 30 supreme-grade spirit stones in exchange for this spirit storage bag." "Fellow Taoist Sun, you want to exchange a mere 30 supreme-grade spirit stones for a spirit storage bag?" Li Xiaowen said coldly, "A spirit storage bag is much more precious than a spirit storage bag. I'm afraid it's not something that can be exchanged with these spirit stones, right?" Sun Fian was a bit embarrassed and rubbed his hands. "I know that this spirit storage bag is priceless, but we rogue cultivators have accumulated it for many years and used many methods, but it's only this many spirit stones. No matter how much more I have, I can't take it out." Xiao Hua's eyes swiveled. He was just about to refuse, but his gaze swept over and saw the eagerness in some people's eyes. His heart involuntarily shuddered, and he thought to himself, "This spirit storage bag is admittedly good, but it's also a scourge. Leaving it with me will definitely arouse the covetous eyes of others. Why don't I exchange it for something else? I don't have any spirit items left." Thinking up to here, Xiao Hua cupped his hands and said with a smile, "Fellow Taoists, I's cultivation is shallow. To be honest, I haven't even heard of this spirit storage bag. If everyone is interested, I am naturally willing to take it out to exchange." "Ayo, that's great." Fu Shu clapped and said, "Does fellow Taoist Xiao have 2 spirit storage bags? Why don't we bid?" Xiao Hua didn't hide it either and nodded, saying, "I indeed picked up 2 spirit storage bags, but they were both empty. I even thought that they were spirit storage bags. In addition, I need cultivation techniques, spirit stones, and the like, but I don't need them for the time being." Cultivation techniques? When everyone heard that there were 2 spirit storage bags, they were delighted at first, but when they heard that Xiao Hua wanted cultivation techniques, they frowned again. For a moment, there was actually an awkward silence. Li Xiaowen looked at everyone and took the initiative to say, "Sigh, fellow Taoist Xiao, I am also an itinerant cultivator. Of course, I know what fellow Taoist lacks. But my heaven-forsaken cultivation technique can only be given to fellow Taoist Xiao by fellow Taoist Qing. We don't have the right to give it to you privately. Moreover, looking at the current situation, I'm afraid that we don't have the cultivation techniques that we obtained ourselves, so we also don't have the means to give it to you." "Sigh, that's right." Everyone also echoed. "How about this? I know that fellow Taoist wants to learn the art of talisman crafting. I am not talented, but I'm willing to teach you with all my heart. What does fellow Taoist Xiao think?" Li Xiaowen, who had never wanted to teach, put forward a very good condition. Unfortunately, Xiao Hua simply didn't care for such a condition. Thinking for a moment, Xiao Hua said, "Fellow Taoist Li's condition really moves I. However, fellow Taoist also wants to cultivate. How could I dare to always disturb you? How about this, if fellow Taoist Li has any talisman crafting ancient books that seem to have the same value as this spirit storage pouch, I will also exchange it." This. Li Xiaowen was somewhat hesitant. To tell the truth, if he were to take out 1 or 2 talisman crafting techniques, it simply wouldn't have the same value as the spirit storage pouch. There were also several people watching from the side, so he couldn't be stingy. Just as Li Xiaowen was hesitating, Sun Fian smiled and said, "Fellow Taoist Xiao, I don't have any talisman crafting techniques here. However, I do have a book on alchemy techniques." "Alchemy techniques?" Hearing this, Li Xiaowen was also astonished. "Fellow Taoist Xiao, the spirit storage pouch is admittedly precious, but it doesn't seem to be as precious as alchemy techniques, right?" "Sigh, I was precisely going to explain to fellow Taoist Xiao. I's alchemy techniques are also incomplete. I also plan to use a book on the basics of artifact crafting from the spirit storage pouch, as well as some spirit stones to exchange with fellow Taoist Xiao." Sun Fian said. "Artifact crafting? Xiao Hua's heart skipped a beat, and he inwardly said, this cultivation technique is admittedly not easy to find, but finding one on alchemy and artifact crafting is also not bad. Soon after, he nodded and said, if fellow Taoist Sun has such a book, even if it's not a cultivation technique, I would be happy to exchange it. Fellow Taoist Xiao, Fu Shu and Fan Daomao were greatly anxious. They hurriedly called out to Xiao Hua, and also stated their conditions. Their things were also not bad, but unfortunately, it was not a cultivation technique, and it was also not to Xiao Hua's liking. They could only cup their hands and say, fellow Taoists, I only picked up 2 spirit storage pouches. For fellow Taoists will definitely be disappointed, so I can only pick up what I need to exchange it. Please forgive me, fellow Daomao. Fu Shu and Fan Daomao were very disappointed, but they also knew that what Xiao Hua said was the truth. On the other hand, Li Xiaowen and Sun Fian were very happy. Li Xiaowen gave Xiao Hua a book on talisman crafting techniques that he obtained. In addition, like Sun Fian, he also gave some top-grade spirit stones as additional compensation. However, how could Xiao Hua accept too many top-grade spirit stones in front of everyone? He only picked up 2 spirit stones of different attributes of the 5 elements. It's only 10 top-grade spirit stones. It shouldn't arouse the evil intentions of others, right? Xiao Hua thought without changing his expression. On the other hand, Li Xiaowen and Sun Fian were overjoyed. They put away the spirit stones that they took out and patted Xiao Hua's shoulder knowingly. After putting everything into his own storage pouch, Xiao Hua took out the 2 spirit storage pouches and handed them to Li Xiaowen and Sun Fian. The 2 of them took them and carefully checked them before putting them into their sleeves. So it was just a guess about the spirit husbandry sect. Since we saw the spirit storage pouches, there's no doubt that the spirit husbandry sect was at that time. Those who commit evil deeds are doomed to destruction. The disciples of such a famous sect actually plotted against fellow Taoist Xiao. Naturally, they ended up being frozen into ice pillars by the ice worms. Sun Fian said with a smile. However, Sun Fian was slightly stunned. He looked at Xiao Hua with a strange expression and asked, fellow Taoist Xiao, since the 2 disciples of the spirit husbandry sect were frozen, how did you escape? Chapter 1360. Looking at the strange expression on Sun Fian's face, Xiao Hua was very annoyed. He wished he could take out all the fireball talismans and smash them down. You say, this person usually keeps his mouth shut and doesn't say anything. Why is he so curious at this time? I gave you the spirit storage pouch and even gave you so many top-grade spirit stones. Why can't I shut your mouth? Xiao Hua thought to himself. Actually, this kind of question generally involved a cultivator's divine ability, so it was naturally secretive and not suitable to be asked. However, Xiao Hua's cultivation was low, and even though his magic power was deep, it was still not enough. In this group of cultivators, he always had the attitude of a junior. Sun Fian's way of asking, the meaning of concern was even more than probing. It was not particularly abrupt. I spoke too much. Sun Fian saw that Xiao Hua was somewhat hesitant and immediately cupped his hands in apology. However, his words had already been said and extremely successfully aroused the curiosity of Li Xiaowen and the others. What was the use of apologizing now? Xiao Hua cursed in his heart. His eyes turned, looked at everyone, and said with a smile, everyone, guess, how did I escape danger? Guess? Sun Fian's eyes widened. He seemed to have heard such a funny answer for the first time. Fellow Taoist Xiao, don't keep us in suspense. This is fellow Taoist's secret. Hee, it's fine if you don't say it. Fu Shu said with a smile, at this time, we should be thinking about whether to continue waiting for fellow Taoist Yong here or look inside. Xiao Hua was very happy in his heart, this Fu Shu is really funny. However, Li Xiaowen's brows did not relax because of Fu Shu's words. Instead, he looked at Xiaohua thoughtfully. Xiaohua very keenly sensed something was wrong and asked awkwardly, "Fellow Daoistly, could it be that you guessed? Is this the reason?" Li Xiaowen thought for a moment, took out a yellow talisman, and handed it over. Xiaohua was slightly stunned. He reached out and took it. When he saw it clearly, his expression changed slightly. That yellow talisman was none other than the fireball talisman that Xiaohua refined. Fellow Taoist Xiao, did you rely on this strange fireball talisman to escape from the group of ice worms in the South Kaiping? Seeing Xiaohua's expression change, Li Xiaowen had a knowing expression and laughed. Xiaohua's thoughts turned rapidly, and his face changed into an extremely embarrassed expression. He said embarrassedly, "It's not I. I wanted to take it out the day before yesterday, but, Sai, you can't blame fellow Taoist Xiao for this." Li Xiaowen took the fireball talisman from Xiaohua's hand and said with a wry smile, "Even I occasionally came across this strange fireball talisman in E.G. I spent a lot of effort to buy a few. I didn't expect fellow Taoist Xiao to be so rich and overbearing, to buy so many." Xiaohua stared blankly and hurriedly said, "Fellow Taoist Li misunderstood. When I bought it, it was very cheap." After thinking for a moment, Li Xiaowen nodded. "I think fellow Taoist bought it early. That's because the strangeness of this fireball talisman hasn't been discovered yet." "Fellow Taoist Li, fellow Taoist Xiao, what are you talking about?" Fan Daomao asked curiously. "How come I don't understand?" No wonder fellow Taoist Fan doesn't understand." Li Xiaowen explained with a smile. After listening for a moment, Xiaohua finally understood. It turned out that after Li Xiaowen got the news that he was going on a treasure hunt, he went to E.G. to purchase the things he needed. He himself was a talisman master, and he also had some acquaintances in E.G. From those sellers, he learned that a very strange fireball talisman had recently appeared in E.G. The talisman paper and talisman ink used to refine these fireball talismans were all low-grade, but the talisman characters on the talisman paper seemed to be naturally formed. It was very obvious that the method of writing high-grade talismans was used on these low-grade fireball talismans. The strangest thing was that the power of these fireball talismans was really terrifying. They were directly comparable to the legendary fireball talismans of the highest grade. Li Xiaowen himself could also refine fireball talismans, but he could only refine low-grade fireball talismans using low-grade talisman paper and talisman ink. Even if he switched to mid-grade talisman paper and talisman ink, only a small portion of the fireball talismans refined would be of mid-grade. If he used high-grade talisman paper and talisman ink, there might be a chance to increase the quality of the fireball talismans to the mid-grade. However, Li Xiaowen wouldn't squander money and use high-grade talisman paper to refine low-grade fireball talismans. Therefore, Li Xiaowen was very curious about this fireball talisman. He found many sellers and spent a lot of spirit stones to buy several talismans. One was for research, and the other was for collection. Even just now in the Southern Color Plain, he only used 2 talismans in an extremely dangerous situation. This fireball talisman is really amazing. Li Xiaowen sighed with emotion. Just now when I used ordinary fireball talismans, or even yellow talismans like fire snake talismans, those ice worms could only be driven away. After a moment, they would chase after me again. However, the flames emitted by this fireball talisman could actually melt the ice worms. If I had a large amount of these fireball talismans, I would be able to calmly escape. I wouldn't be in such a difficult situation. Ah! There's actually such a bizarre fireball talisman. Sun Fian said in astonishment. Which expert refined this fireball talisman? When Xiaohua heard this, his heart violently beat. Li Xiaowen sighed with emotion. According to reliable sources, this fireball talisman is the work of 3 old monsters of the Ardent Fire Mountain. 3 old monsters of the Ardent Fire Mountain? Fan Daomao's eyes widened. Those are nascent soul stage cultivators. They were bored enough to refine this fireball talisman, for what? Nascent soul stage cultivators are all old monsters who have lived for who knows how many years. Moreover, their temperaments are all strange. Who knows what they're thinking? Maybe, because they're idle and bored. Sun Fian said disdainfully. But I also have some doubts. Li Xiaowen scratched his head and said, if they were bored and gave pointers to juniors, refining a few would be fine. But it's said that EG has quite a few of these fireball talismans. These 3 old seniors can't always be refining these low-level yellow talismans, right? When Xiaohua heard this, he laughed and said, it's nothing. Maybe they've accumulated it for many years, and their disciples took it all out to exchange for spirit stones. MN, fellow Taoist Zhao's conjecture is quite reliable. Li Xiaowen nodded and asked again, when did fellow Taoist Zhao discover this fireball talisman? Long ago. I discovered it on EG a few days after I followed Senior Qing to Jingbua City. At that time, the price was very cheap. Xiaohua didn't conceal the time. No wonder fellow Taoist Xiao was very generous when he threw out these fireball talismans, as if he didn't feel any heartache. Li Xiaowen laughed. Xiaohua took out several fireball talismans from his storage pouch and handed them to the 4 people, saying, when I bought them, they weren't expensive to begin with. Naturally, I didn't feel any heartache. However, there aren't many left in the southern color plane that relied on them to blast open a path. Please kindly accept these, fellow Taoists. I's also very curious about such a miraculous fireball talisman. Sun Fian and the others very happily took them and carefully looked at them before putting them away in their storage pouches. They weren't talisman masters, so their understanding was limited. However, supreme-grade fireball talismans could save lives in certain situations. This was something they knew very well. Alright, fellow Taoist Xiao, being able to escape was beyond our expectations. Our treasure hunt has increased by another percentage. Li Xiaowen clapped his hands and said, but next, should we continue to wait here for fellow Taoist Yong? Or should we go and provide support? Fu Shu had just asked this question, but now that Li Xiaowen brought it up again, everyone looked at each other, not saying a word more. The situation was very obvious. Even the 2nd-level qi condensation Xiaohua had flown out, but the 4th-level qi condensation Yong Shang still hadn't come out. Was there any need to say what happened to Yong Shang? Perhaps he'd already been frozen into an icicle. Waiting was definitely not a good strategy, so they could only go in and search. However, everyone had just escaped from inside and had almost lost their lives. Who would dare to go in again? However, if they didn't go in, they wouldn't be able to get Yong Shang's silk bag, and they wouldn't be able to find the place arranged by Qing Fengmin. Giving up like this was admittedly something they weren't willing to do, but taking the risk of death was something they didn't dare to do even more. What should they do? The 5 people looked at each other and stared at each other. None of them spoke. After a long while, Fan Daomao sighed. Alas, what a pity, what's there to pity? If fellow Taoist goes, we're willing to. Fu Shu said halfway and smiled wryly. We can't go, and I don't have anything to promise. If it really doesn't work out, then you and I will disperse. Our Heaven's Forsaken isn't the first time it's been organized. There will be opportunities in the future. It's still useful to keep our lives. Fan Daomao glanced at Fu Shu and shook his head. Fellow Taoist Fu misunderstands. What I pity is Yong Shang. I heard this guy say that he just obtained a cultivation method. It's said that it's an extremely powerful divine ability. It doesn't matter if he dies, but that cultivation method is only frozen in an icicle. It's really a waste of God's gift. Cultivation method? Xiaohua's heart jumped when he heard this, but he looked at Fan Daomao and didn't quite believe it. Fellow Taoist Fan, are you telling the truth? You're not deceiving everyone, right? Li Xiaowen said softly. Fan Daomao rolled his eyes at Li Xiaowen and said impatiently, fellow Taoist Li presumably knows about Ai's friendship with Yongshang. It's not strange for I to know about this kind of thing, right? And, that's true. The two fellow Taoists are also inseparable from each other in Heaven's Forsaken. I can clearly see that this cultivation method is really a pity. Li Xiaowen sighed. Fellow Taoist Xiao, didn't you not have a suitable cultivation method? This thing seems to be extremely suitable for you. Sun Fian suddenly said. Xiaohua smiled bitterly. I want it, but I also need to cultivate it in my current life. That might not be the case. Fu Shu glanced at the valley behind him and said, I think that fellow Taoist Xiao has a chance to find that cultivation method. Strange, why is that? Li Xiaowen didn't wait for Xiaohua to speak and asked. Fellow Taoist Li, you see, fellow Taoist Xiao was clearly lucky to escape from the southern color plains. Moreover, he has a fireball talisman in his storage bag that is very good against ice worms. Fellow Taoist Li only obtained this fireball talisman a few days ago, but fellow Taoist Xiao was actually able to purchase it a month ago. Presumably, he has some fate with the southern color plains. Say, if someone can enter the southern color plains, wouldn't fellow Taoist Xiao be the only one suitable? Chapter 1361. Hearing this, Xiaohua sneered in his heart. He could still see through this little trick. Yes, fellow Taoist Fu's words are reasonable. Li Xiaowen nodded, but when he saw that Xiaohua didn't bat an eyelid, he smiled and said, however, the South Kaiping is extremely dangerous. It's one thing to be able to escape, but fellow Taoist Xiao wouldn't risk his life for a cultivation technique that he doesn't even know exists. Don't you think so? Fellow Taoist Xiao. He, fellow Taoist Li is right. Xiaohua smiled and didn't say anything else. How about this, fellow Taoist Xiao, if you can find fellow Taoist Yang's silk bag, fellow Taoist Yang's storage bag will belong to fellow Taoist Xiao. Everything inside, including the things abandoned by us, we can let fellow Taoist Xiao take them all. What do you think? Fan Daomao's eyes turned rapidly as he continued. Sun Fian shook his head. Fellow Taoist Fan is wrong. If fellow Taoist Xiao really finds the silk bag, that storage bag originally belonged to fellow Taoist Xiao. What right do we have to stop him? Then, he looked at Xiaohua and said, however, fellow Taoist Xiao, if you can get the silk bag, after I find the treasure in the future, I'll give you 20% of it. What do you think? Yes, yes. Fan Daomao and Fu Shu also echoed. We also have the same idea. Then, they looked at Li Xiaowen and said, fellow Taoist Li, how about we give fellow Taoist Xiao 20% of our things as well? This isn't impossible. Li Xiaowen looked at Xiaohua and said, if you can really take out the silk bag, then you'll give us a second chance to find the treasure. It's only right that we give 20% of the things. Xiaohua originally didn't want to pay attention to it, but seeing the four of them say so, he couldn't help but feel moved. These 5 escaped before me. They definitely didn't encounter the Ice Worm King. It was just ordinary ice worms chasing them. Moreover, from what everyone said, Yongshang seemed to have followed them for a long time. If he died, he wouldn't have been close to the canyon where the Ice Worm King was. Li Xiaowen and company were probably chased by the ice worms and thought that the canyon was filled with ice worms. However, I was the last to fly out, so I didn't see any ice worms along the way. Even if there is a group of ice worms, as long as it is not the Ice Worm King, I can still escape freely. Who would be afraid of them? Thinking of this, Xiaohua looked at everyone and said with a smile, I had a hard time encountering Tianqi's operation, so of course I don't want to give up, but I's cultivation is still shallow, and escaping is already a fluke. I really don't want to sell my life for these treasures. If any fellow Taoist wishes to go, I am also willing to take out my 20%. Oh, and I will also gift the few fireball talismans I have to that fellow Taoist. Some treasures. Fu Shu smiled bitterly and said, fellow Taoist Xiao, 20% for each of us is already a lot. The share of the four of us is about the same as fellow Taoist Xiao's share. Fu Shu directly omitted Xiaohua's last two sentences, looking very earnest and well-intentioned. How about this? Li Xiaowen said, if fellow Taoist Xiao is willing to go, each of us will take out 25% of the treasures to round it up to fellow Taoist Xiao, how about it? Very good, we agree. Of course, no one had any objections and looked at Xiaohua eagerly. Xiaohua scratched his chin with his finger and looked at the distant canyon entrance. After a long while, he sighed and said, alas, poor people have short ambitions. Who told I to not have a suitable cultivation method? Since that's the case, I will go. Great. Everyone clapped their hands and praised. Fellow Taoist Xiao, shouldn't you leave your silk bag behind first? Fan Daomao probed. If I can't come back, what's the use of taking 4 silk bags? Xiaohua sneered. He, fellow Taoist Xiao is right. Fan Daomao smiled and said no more. Since he had made up his mind to take the risk, Xiaohua asked Li Xiaowen for a connecting note talisman as well as a few other yellow talismans before flying towards the canyon. After Xiaohua flew away, Li Xiaowen and the others looked at each other. They all had the same thought in their eyes. Then, they all returned to the foothills and sat cross-legged, waiting quietly. Do you all think I am a fool? Xiaohua slowly flew into the canyon. As he pondered, he sneered and said, everyone's cultivation is much higher than this poor Taoist's, but not a single one of them dares to come forward. Instead, you're tempting this young master with your words. I wonder who will be the one to benefit in the end. Xiaohua didn't fly very fast. After flying for a while, he saw that it was the same as when he came out. There was nothing special in the entire canyon. Unconsciously, his courage grew. He looked back and saw that there shouldn't be anyone following him, so he increased his speed and looked for the path he came out of. Because he was looking for Yongshang, and it was more likely that he was looking for Yongshang's corpse, Xiaohua flew very low and carefully looked at the bottom of the canyon. At this time, the sky was already bright. In the far eastern horizon, a red sun was gushing out from the sea of clouds. The entire world was full of vitality. Unlike the vitality in the early morning, the canyon Xiaohua was in was abnormally cold. The deeper he went, the more ice and frost he saw. Of course, there were also many strange spiritual herbs along the way. Xiaohua didn't care about them. As long as he could pick them, he would pick them and transplant them into the space. Just when Xiaohua was about to move a foot-tall spirit grass into the space, he suddenly remembered that he had placed the Ice Worm King's egg into the space last night. Could it be that the spirit grass inside would be frozen to death? When Xiaohua immersed his thoughts into the space, he found that everything was the same as usual. That egg-shaped Ice Worm King egg was placed inside, and the spiritual herbs were not affected at all. And, fortunately, I was a bit anxious last night. Fortunately, nothing happened. Xiaohua sighed in relief and threw the Ice Worm King egg into the furthest corner of the space, letting it be far away from the spiritual herbs. Just when Xiaohua was checking the space, from the southern plain, far away from Xiaohua, came a "ga" sound. Although it was far away, the sound seemed to be able to resonate in people's hearts. Xiaohua's heart shook when he heard it. He quickly pulled his mind out of the space and dodged. Not caring whether it was useful or not, he hid between a mountain rock at the bottom of the canyon. GGA. Another two hurried sounds shook Xiaohua's little heart and made it beat wildly. Then, it was silent again. What is this thing? Xiaohua's face was gloomy. He thought to himself, listening to that sound, it should be a kind of bird. This thing actually dares to call out in the Ice Worm King's territory. I'm afraid, it came here to cause trouble. A single Ice Worm King can freeze I to death without even getting close. Adding on an inexplicable bird, won't I be dead? When the city gate is on fire, the fish in the moat will also suffer. I better not get involved with others. Thinking about this, Xiaohua lost his enthusiasm to explore. He came here because he knew that there were no ice worms in this canyon. Since there was an unknown danger, he naturally had to retreat. Just as Xiaohua turned around, his gaze suddenly landed on a large tree halfway up the mountain with only bare branches, and there was actually a person looking down on it. Ah! Xiaohua was slightly startled. His body stopped for a moment, not daring to move. Seeing that person also not moving, he raised his voice and said, "Fellow Taoist, please," that person still didn't move. Could it be a dead person? Xiaohua stared blankly and thought to himself, in the southern color plains, everyone was frozen to death. This person, Xiaohua didn't dare to approach. He soared up and looked from afar. When he saw clearly, he couldn't help but be shocked. Io, isn't this Yongshang? Why wasn't he frozen into an ice pillar by the ice worm? Moreover, there's a ball of blood on his back. Xiaohua suddenly understood. Just now, he was looking at those ice pillars and didn't pay attention to the two sides of the stone wall. Of course, he couldn't see Yongshang's corpse. When Xiaohua took Yongshang's corpse down from the mountain and saw the fatal wound on the corpse, he couldn't help but gasp. He saw that Yongshang's body didn't have the slightest trace of being frozen by the ice worm. Only his Taoist robe was a bit messy. And in Yongshang's heart, there was a sharp hole. Inside the hole, the blood had already flowed out. That human heart was also gone. This clearly wasn't done by the ice worm. Could it be, there are other powerful spirit beasts in the southern color plains? Xiaohua suddenly thought of the mind-shaking cry he heard just now. He couldn't help but feel a chill in his heart. He didn't dare to delay any longer and picked up Yongshang's corpse. First, he threw everything in the storage bag into his own space. Then, he took out the silk bag and put it into his storage bag. He hurriedly urged his magic power and quickly flew out of the valley. His anxious appearance like a stray dog was really laughable. Fortunately, Xiaohua didn't go too far. He didn't use any notes talismans. In the time it took to drink a cup of tea, he already arrived at the valley's entrance. Xiaohua slowed down and shouted loudly, "Fellow Taoistly, fellow Taoistly." Hearing Xiaohua's shout, Li Xiaowen and the others were all stunned. They looked at each other and all soared up. They didn't expect Xiaohua to come out so quickly. Some people didn't even think that Xiaohua would be able to come back safely. When they saw Yongshang's corpse, they were greatly shocked. They naturally looked at Yongshang's waist. Of course, the storage bag on his waist was already put into Xiaohua's sleeve, causing them to be slightly disappointed. "Fellow Taoist Xiao, did you get the silk bag?" Li Xiaowen's gaze swept over the corpse and immediately asked. "Fortunately, I didn't disappoint you. It is already in I's storage bag," Xiaohua said with a smile. As he spoke, Xiaohua put down Yongshang's corpse. He patted his storage bag and took out two silk bags. He shook them in front of everyone and put them back into his storage bag. "Good." Li Xiaowen and the others finally let out a sigh of relief. Looking at Yongshang's corpse, Sun Fian frowned and said, "Where did you find fellow Taoist Yong's corpse? Is it far from the valley's entrance?" Xiaohua had already thought of a countermeasure. He said in a low voice, "It's a bit far." It was on a withered tree on a cliff. If it wasn't for Ai's sharp eyes, I'm afraid I wouldn't have been able to find it. But... Fellow Daoist Yang's injury, what's going on? I am a bit puzzled. Xiaohua pointed at Yong Shang's chest and asked. You're tuning in to the Blissful Bookshelf YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.